The gunshot echoed across the New Mexico desert like thunder cutting through the stillness of the night. Mason Carter pressed himself against the rocky outcrop, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts as he listened for the sounds of pursuit. Blood seeped through his fingers where he clutched his left shoulder warm and sticky against his calloused palm. The bullet had torn through muscle, but missed bone small mercies in a merciless land. The desert night stretched cold and vast around him, indifferent to his suffering. Stars spilled across the black canvas of sky, brilliant and mocking in their serenity. Mason knew the patrol would be searching for his trailmen, who once called him brother, now hunting him like a rabid coyote. Deserters faced the firing squad. Deserters who shot their commanding officers faced worse. Mason forced himself to move each step, sending fresh waves of pain through his wounded shoulder. His horse had bolted during the ambush, taking most of his supplies with it. All that remained was his Winchester rifle, Colt revolver, a half-empty canteen, and the small leather pouch he kept always at his side. 3 miles northwest, a small stream cut through the desert floor. If he could reach it by dawn, he might have a chance to clean his wound and throw off his pursuers. Mason oriented himself by the North Star and began the long walk, each footfall careful and deliberate on the treacherous ground. His mind drifted to the events that had led him here, a lifetime of service to the U.S. cavalry reduced to ashes in a single day of conscience. Eagle Canyon. The name alone made his stomach twist with nausea. What was supposed to be a negotiation with the Apache band had turned into a massacre when Captain Hargrove gave the order to open fire on the unarmed delegation. Mason could still hear the screams, see the looks of betrayal on the faces of men who had come in peace, only to be cut down without warning. When Mason had refused to fire on women and children, Hargrove had called him a coward, ordered him to be arrested. In the chaos that followed, Mason had shot his commanding officer in the leg and fled. That was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of running, hiding, and nursing the festering wound in his soul far deeper than the bullet hole in his shoulder. As he crested a small rise, the smell hit him first, the metallic tang of blood carried on the desert breeze. Then came the sound, a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Wolves. Mason dropped to a crouch, scanning the moonlit landscape. In the shallow valley below, dark shapes moved around something on the ground. 5, no 6 wolves circling what appeared to be a fresh kill. Even from this distance, Mason could see they were lean ribs showing through matted fur. The drought had pushed the desert predators to desperation. He was about to give the pack a wide berth when he realized his wound had reopened, blood soaking through his makeshift bandage. The scent would carry in the still night air. Already one of the wolves had raised its head, nostrils flaring as it caught the smell of fresh blood. Mason backed away slowly, but his boot dislodged a small cascade of stones that clattered down the slope. 6 pairs of yellow eyes swiveled in his direction. "Damn," he muttered, reaching for his rifle. The largest wolf, a silver-gray beast with a scarred muzzle, separated from the pack and began moving toward him. The others followed, abandoning their kill in favor of fresher prey. Mason retreated, searching for defensible ground. 20 yards back stood a large boulder, its top too high for the wolves to reach. If he could make it there, he broke into a run, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. Behind him, the wolves gave chase, closing the distance with frightening speed. Mason reached the boulder and scrambled up its rough surface, fingernails breaking as he clawed for handholds. He had just pulled himself onto the flat top when snapping jaws closed on empty air where his boot had been moments before. Safe for now, Mason lay on his back, staring up at the cold stars while the wolves circled below. His shoulder throbbed in time with his racing heart. The fever was setting in. He could feel the unnatural heat spreading through his body, despite the cool night air. The wolves settled in to wait their patience as vast as the desert itself. They knew what Mason knew: a wounded man alone couldn't stay on top of a rock forever. Thirst, hunger, or blood loss would eventually force him down. As the moon climbed higher, Mason examined his wound by its silver light. The skin around the bullet hole was red and swollen, with angry lines beginning to spread outward. Blood poisoning. Without proper treatment, he'd be dead in days if the wolves didn't get him first. From his perch, Mason could see for miles across the moonlit desert. It was beautiful in its stark simplicity. Mesas rising like ancient monuments, sage and cacti dotting the landscape like solitary sentinels. A land both harsh and breathtaking, where only the strong or the lucky survived. Mason's hand moved to the small leather pouch at his side. From it, he withdrew an object wrapped in soft buckskin. Unwrapping it carefully, he revealed an Apache arrow point unlike any standard hunting or war arrow. This one was intricately carved from black obsidian with strange symbols etched into its surface that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. The old medicine man had pressed it into Mason's palm 5 years ago, after Mason had pulled him from a flash flood that would have surely claimed his life. "This arrow seeks its rightful owner," the old man had said in halting English. "When it finds him, blood debt will be paid, and your soul healed." Mason had kept it as a curious talisman, never fully understanding its meaning. Now, facing death alone in the desert, he wondered if the arrow's purpose would die with him, another failure to add to his growing list. The wolves grew restless, pacing around the boulder with increasing agitation. The largest one leaped partway up the rock face claws, scraping against stone as it tried to reach him. Mason kicked at it, and the wolf fell back with a snarl. Then, cutting through the night like a knife, came the distant crack of gunfire. One shot, then 2 more in rapid succession. The wolves' heads swiveled toward the sound, ears pricked forward. More shots followed, along with something that turned Mason's blood cold, high-pitched screams that could only belong to children. The wolves hesitated, torn between the wounded man trapped on the rock and the promise of easier prey. When another volley of shots rang out, followed by more screaming, the pack made its decision. As one, they abandoned their vigil and loped toward the sounds of distress, silver fur gleaming under the moonlight. Mason watched them go, relief and dread warring in his chest. Someone else was in trouble, perhaps fatally so. He could stay where he was, tend his wound, and hope to survive the night, or he could follow the wolves and likely die trying to help strangers who might already be beyond saving. The screams came again, weaker this time. Children's voices. With a curse, Mason slid down from the boulder, landing awkwardly on his good arm. Pain lanced through his injured shoulder, nearly sending him to his knees. He gritted his teeth and forced himself upright, checking his weapons by practiced reflex. 6 rounds in the Colt, 4 in the Winchester. Not much, but it would have to do. Following the wolves' tracks in the moonlight, Mason moved as swiftly as his wounded body allowed. The sounds of conflict grew louder, snarls, screams, and the crack of what sounded like a single rifle being fired at irregular intervals. He crested a small rise, and the scene below made his heart stutter. A small Apache camp lay in ruins, supplies scattered across the desert floor. 2 bodies, an elderly man and woman, lay motionless near a smoldering fire pit. The wolves were circling an overturned wagon, where what appeared to be 2 small children huddled in terror. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, stood in front of the wagon with a rifle nearly as tall as she was. The weapon wavered in her small hands as she aimed it at the approaching wolves. Behind her, a younger child, a little girl of maybe 7, pressed herself against the wagon's wooden side, eyes wide with terror. The older girl fired the rifle's recoil, nearly knocking her over. The shot went wide, doing nothing but further agitating the wolves. 3 of the beasts had already begun to close in, sensing easy prey. Mason didn't think. He raised his Winchester, sighted down the barrel at the nearest wolf, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the canyon, and the wolf dropped mid-leap dead before it hit the ground. The rest of the pack turned toward this new threat, giving the children a moment's reprieve. Mason worked the lever action and fired again, hitting another wolf in the shoulder. It stumbled, but didn't fall. He broke into a run, closing the distance to the wagon, while firing his 3rd shot at the largest wolf, the scarred leader he'd encountered earlier. The bullet caught it in the flank, spinning it around with a howl of pain and rage. "Get down!" Mason shouted to the girl with the rifle as he reached the wagon. She looked at him with wide, dark eyes, filled with equal parts hope and suspicion, but ducked behind the wagon's protection. The wounded wolves circled warily now, recognizing a more dangerous opponent. Mason stood his ground, Winchester raised, despite the fire burning through his injured shoulder. Blood soaked his shirt, the coppery scent driving the wolves into a frenzy of hunger and frustration. The pack attacked as one, coming from multiple directions. Mason fired his last rifle round, then dropped the Winchester and drew his Colt. The revolver barked twice in rapid succession, dropping 2 more wolves. A third leaped at him from the side jaws, snapping. Mason pivoted, but too slowly pain exploded across his forearm as teeth sank into flesh. He slammed the butt of his revolver into the wolf's skull once, twice, until it released its grip with a yelp. 2 shots left. 2 wolves remaining. The largest wolf, still bleeding from its flank wound, stalked forward with deadly purpose. Behind it, the last unwounded member of the pack mirrored its movements, looking for an opening. Mason backed toward the wagon, placing himself between the predators and the children. His vision was beginning to blur, blood loss and fever taking their toll. He would get one chance at this. The lead wolf charged. Mason waited until the last possible moment, then fired directly into its open jaws. The beast collapsed at his feet, dead instantly. The final wolf hesitated, then turned and fled into the darkness. Mason sagged against the wagon's strength, draining from his limbs like water through sand. His Colt slipped from nerveless fingers. Through dimming vision, he saw the older girl emerge from behind the wagon rifle, still clutched in her small hands. As he slid to the ground, something caught his eye, a patterned cloth around the girl's neck. Despite the poor light and his fading consciousness, he could make out the design identical to the symbols etched on the obsidian arrow point he carried. "The arrow finds its owner," he whispered, the old medicine man's words echoing in his mind as darkness claimed him. Mason drifted in and out of consciousness, fragmented impressions filtering through the haze of fever. Small hands pressing something cool and wet against his forehead. The bitter taste of herbs on his tongue. Soft voices speaking in Apache, then English. Pain as something probed his shoulder wound, followed by blessed numbness. When he finally clawed his way back to full awareness, the first thing he saw was the canvas ceiling of a small shelter, early morning light filtering through its seams. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his shoulder. "Don't move," a young voice commanded in accented English. "Wound will open." Mason turned his head to find the older girl from the wagon watching him with solemn dark eyes. Up close, she appeared older than he'd first thought, perhaps 11 or 12, with the weathered look of a child forced to grow up too quickly. Her long black hair was tied back with a leather thong, and around her neck hung the patterned cloth he'd noticed before passing out. "You helped us," she said, her tone making it half statement, half-question. Why? Mason licked dry lips. Seemed like the right thing to do. His voice came out as a rasp. The girl studied him for a long moment, then reached for a water skin and held it to his lips. The water was tepid but clean, and Mason drank gratefully. "My name Mason Carter," he said when he'd drunk his fill. "What's yours?" The girl hesitated, weighing caution against courtesy. "I am Winona," she finally said. "My sister is Kaya." She gestured to a small figure huddled at the far end of the shelter, the younger girl who watched him with wide, frightened eyes, but made no sound. Mason noticed his shoulder had been cleaned and bandaged with strips of cloth. The angry red lines of infection seemed less pronounced than before. "You fixed my wound," he said, nodding toward his shoulder. Winona shrugged. "I know some medicine. Not as good as Mother, but enough to stop blood poison." She tilted her head, curiosity overcoming caution. "You are Bluecoat soldier." Mason tensed. "I was. Not anymore." "Why you help Apache children? Most white men shoot us, or worse." The bitter truth of her words hung in the air between them. Mason had seen firsthand what, or worse, entailed during his years with the cavalry. "Not all white men are the same," he said quietly. "Just like not all Apache are the same." Winona considered this, then nodded slightly. "The wolves are dead. 5 dead. 1 ran off." "Good." Her young face hardened with a hatred no child should know. "They killed my grandparents. We tried to fight, but—" She trailed off, glancing at her silent sister. Mason followed her gaze. Kaya hadn't moved or spoken, her small face a mask of trauma. "She's been like this since the attack." Winona nodded, pain flashing across her features. "She saw wolves, saw what they did to grandfather." She swallowed hard. "Kaya has not spoken since." Mason had seen similar reactions in soldiers after particularly brutal battles, the mind retreating from horrors too great to bear. Some recovered with time. Others never spoke again. "I'm sorry." He said the words inadequate, but sincere. Winona straightened her shoulders, assuming a dignity beyond her years. "We must go soon. Need to reach Mother before—" She stopped, seeming to catch herself. "Before what?" The girl busied herself with checking his bandages. "We were traveling with grandparents to find special medicine plant. For Mother. She is very sick." Mason winced as she prodded the wound. "Where is your mother?" "In hidden place. 3 days' journey." She pointed southwest toward a distant mountain range barely visible on the horizon. "Sacred canyon where our people hide from bluecoats." The implications were clear. They were heading into the heart of Apache territory, likely to one of the secret strongholds where families of warriors took shelter during campaigns against the U.S. Army. No place for a white man, especially a former cavalry scout. "I can help you get there," Mason said, surprising himself with the offer. Winona's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Why white man want to go to Apache land? It was a fair question, one for which Mason had no simple answer. Part of it was basic human decency. He couldn't leave 2 children alone in the wilderness. Part was the strange connection he felt to the symbol on her neckcloth, identical to his arrow point. And part, he admitted to himself, was the hope for redemption, a chance to balance the scales after years of participating in the Army's campaign against the Apache. "You saved my life," he said instead. "I owe you a debt. And 2 children alone won't survive long out here, wolves, soldiers, outlaws." Winona seemed unconvinced. "We are Apache. We know desert better than white man." "I don't doubt it, but I have guns, and your rifle has no more bullets." He nodded toward the empty weapon propped against the shelter wall. "And your sister needs protection while she heals inside." He tapped his temple meaningfully. The girl considered his words, looking from Mason to her silent sister and back again. "We leave when sun is highest," she finally said. "If you slow us down, we leave you." Mason nodded, accepting her terms. Fair enough. As Winona left the shelter to gather their few remaining supplies, Mason carefully sat up, testing his strength. The wound throbbed, but the fever had receded. Whatever herbal poultice the girl had applied was working. His gaze fell on Kaya, still watching him with those huge, haunted eyes. He smiled gently, making his voice soft. "Hello, Kaya. My name's Mason. I'll be traveling with you and your sister for a while, if that's all right." The child gave no indication she'd heard him, her expression unchanged. But, as Mason settled back against his makeshift bedding, he noticed her small hand moving in the dirt beside her drawing patterns with her finger. He couldn't make out what they were from his position, but the very act of creation seemed hopeful, a tiny spark of life in eyes, otherwise empty. Outside, Mason could hear Winona moving around the camp, gathering what could be salvaged from the wreckage. His thoughts turned to the journey ahead. 3 days to the hidden canyon, assuming Winona knew the way. 3 days through Apache territory, where any patrol or settler would shoot him on sight, and any Apache warrior would do the same once they identified him as former cavalry. Yet something told him this journey was meant to be. The arrow point burning like a coal in his pouch. The matching symbol around Winona's neck, coincidences too perfect to be mere chance. Mason reached for his leather pouch, confirming it was still at his side. Inside the obsidian arrow point gleamed black as night, its carved symbols seeming to shift in the dim light. He rewrapped it carefully and tucked it away just as Winona re-entered the shelter. "We must bury grandparents," she said, her voice steady but eyes betraying her grief. "Apache way." Mason nodded and pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the protest from his wounded shoulder. "I'll help." Together, they stepped out into the harsh desert sunlight. The bodies of the wolves lay where they had fallen already, drawing buzzards. Beyond them, the still forms of the elderly couple rested beside the extinguished fire. Mason averted his eyes from the wounds that had ended their lives, focusing instead on the practical matter of burial. "Apache do not dig deep graves," Winona explained as she gathered stones. "We cover with rocks to keep animals away. Spirits must be free to travel." Mason began collecting larger stones from the surrounding area, each movement sending fresh pain through his injured shoulder and arm. By the time they had gathered enough to cover both bodies, sweat soaked his shirt, and his vision swam with exhaustion. Winona spoke words in Apache over the cairns, her young voice strong and clear in the desert stillness. Though Mason couldn't understand the language, the emotion behind the ritual transcended words, respect, grief, and a final farewell. When she finished, Winona turned to her sister, who had watched the entire proceeding in silence from the shelter entrance. "Come, Kaya," she said gently. "We must go now. Mother is waiting." The younger girl moved forward like a sleepwalker, her small feet dragging in the dust. When she reached the cairns, she knelt and placed something atop each pile of stones, small twisted figures made from scraps of cloth and twigs. Dolls, Mason realized. Toys she had made for her grandparents to take with them on their spirit journey. The simple gesture of childlike faith amid such tragedy made Mason's throat tighten. He turned away, giving the children privacy in their grief. By midday, they had salvaged what they could from the destroyed camp, a water skin, some dried meat, a small cooking pot, and a few blankets. Not much to sustain 3 people on a 3-day journey through hostile territory, but it would have to suffice. "Which way?" Mason asked, adjusting his rifle strap to distribute weight away from his injured shoulder. Winona pointed southwest toward the distant mountains. "We follow Sunset Path first day, then turn at Split Rock to find Hidden Trail." Mason nodded. The girl clearly knew the route, which was fortunate given his own unfamiliarity with this particular stretch of desert. "You stay behind me," he told her, "and keep Kaya close. If I signal to stop or hide you, do it immediately. No questions." Winona translated this for her sister, who gave no acknowledgement beyond a slight blink. The older girl took Kaya's hand, and together they set off across the sun-baked landscape, leaving behind the remains of their grandparents and the wolves that had taken them. The heat built as the day progressed, the sun a merciless eye watching their slow progress across the desert floor. Mason kept a steady pace, conscious of the children's shorter legs and the need to conserve water and strength. Every half hour he scanned the horizon for dust clouds that might indicate cavalry patrols or Apache scouts. By late afternoon, Winona began to lag, fatigue evident in her dragging steps. Kaya moved like an automaton, her small face slack with exhaustion. "We'll rest there," Mason decided, pointing to a cluster of boulders that offered both shade and defensive position. "Cool down until evening, then travel by night when it's safer." Winona nodded gratefully, too tired to maintain her stoic facade. They settled in the deepest patch of shade, rationing small sips of water from the skin. Mason checked his weapons and surveyed their surroundings while the girls rested. From their elevated position, he could see for miles across the harsh landscape. No sign of pursuit or other travelers, a small blessing in a day filled with challenges. His shoulder throbbed with dull persistence, but the infection seemed contained for now. As the worst heat of the day began to subside, Mason noticed Kaya watching him with those same haunted eyes. On impulse, he pointed to the sky where the first evening star had appeared, despite the lingering daylight. "That's Venus," he said softly. "The evening star. Apache call it Copper Star Woman, don't they?" Winona, roused from her light doze, looked surprised. "You know Apache star names?" Mason nodded. "Learned from a scout I worked with. He taught me some of your language, too. Ahihi means thank you, right? Ahihi." Winona corrected his pronunciation, but there was a new respect in her gaze. "How you learn these things. Not all soldiers hate the Apache," Mason said carefully. "Some of us tried to understand. But you still fought us." The accusation hung in the air, justified and unanswerable. Mason looked away, shame burning hotter than his fever had. "Yes," he admitted. "I fought, until I couldn't anymore." Something in his tone must have reached her, because Winona's next question came without its previous edge. "What made you stop?" Mason considered how much to tell them, how much two children who had already seen too much horror should hear. "I was ordered to do something wrong," he finally said. "Something I couldn't live with, so I left." "You ran away?" "Yes." Winona digested this, then nodded once, apparently satisfied with his honesty, if not his past actions. "We should move soon. Night travel is safer." As they prepared to continue their journey, Mason noticed Kaya had drawn something in the dust beside her, a rough sketch of the evening star with smaller stars surrounding it, like a family. It was the first sign of engagement he'd seen from the traumatized child, and it kindled a small flame of hope in his chest. They traveled through the cooler night hours, guided by stars, and Winona's unerring sense of direction. The desert transformed under moonlight, shadows deepening, and distances becoming deceptive. Nocturnal creatures emerged, owls gliding silently overhead, coyotes yipping in the distance, small rodents scurrying from their path. Mason kept them moving at a sustainable pace, watching for signs of danger in the silver-washed landscape. His years as a scout had taught him to read the desert, to notice disturbances in the natural pattern of things. So far, they appeared to be alone in this vast emptiness. Around midnight, they paused for rest near a dry wash lined with mesquite trees. Mason checked his wound while Winona shared out small portions of dried meat. The angry red lines had receded further, though the wound itself remained tender and inflamed. "Your medicine working," he said, nodding toward his shoulder. "Fever's gone." Winona accepted the compliment with a small shrug. "Mother is much better healer. She knows all plants, all spirits." "Is that what she's sick with, fever?" The girl's expression darkened. "No, different sickness. Started after soldiers came to our old village." She looked away, her profile sharp against the night sky. "Many died same way, like poison in blood." Mason frowned. Epidemic diseases sometimes swept through Apache communities, often introduced by contact with white settlers. But Winona's description sounded different, more targeted, more suspicious. "Your mother's a healer, a medicine woman." Winona nodded. "Best of our people. That's why we need special plant from Sacred Mountain. Only medicine strong enough." As they spoke, Mason noticed Kaya had moved closer, listening intently despite her continued silence. The younger child's eyes moved between them, following the conversation with clear understanding, even if she chose not to participate. "We should sleep," Mason decided. "Few hours, then move on before dawn." He took first watch, sitting with his back against a mesquite trunk, while the girls curled up beneath a shared blanket. The night wrapped around them like a cool cloak, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. In another life, Mason might have found peace in such a moment. The vast desert, the infinite sky, the simplicity of existence reduced to survival. But peace eluded him, as it had since Eagle Canyon. Behind his closed eyes, he still saw the faces of the Apache delegation cut down without warning. Still heard Hargrove's cold order, "Fire at will, leave none alive." Mason had refused, had turned his weapon on Hargrove instead. Too late to save most of the Apache, but perhaps in time to prevent the massacre from extending to the nearby camp, where women and children waited. He never learned if they escaped. He'd been too busy fleeing himself, a bullet in his shoulder and the brand of traitor seared into his name. Now, by strange circumstance, he found himself guardian to two Apache children heading into the heart of territory controlled by the very people he had once hunted. The irony was not lost on him. His hand strayed to the leather pouch at his side, fingers tracing the outline of the arrow point within. "When it finds its rightful owner, blood debt will be paid, and your soul healed," the old medicine man had said. Was Winona that owner? Or someone at their destination? Mason's musings were interrupted by a soft sound, Kaya whimpering in her sleep, caught in the grip of nightmare. He watched as Winona instantly awoke and gathered her sister close, murmuring soothing words in Apache, until the younger girl quieted. The tenderness of the moment, the fierce protectiveness of a child, forced to become parent to her sister, struck Mason with unexpected force. Whatever else happened on this journey, he would see these two safely to their destination. He owed them that much, and perhaps owed himself the chance at redemption their safety might represent. When the girls woke a few hours later, Mason had already scouted ahead, confirming their path was clear for the coming day's travel. They ate sparingly of their dwindling supplies, then continued southwest as the eastern sky began to lighten with dawn. The second day brought new challenges, a steeper terrain as they approached the foothills of the mountain range, and with it, the increased risk of encountering others. This was contested land claimed by both Apache and the U.S. government, patrolled by cavalry and watched by indigenous scouts. By mid-morning, they had reached a narrow canyon that would provide both shade and concealment for the hottest hours. As they picked their way along its winding floor, Mason's instincts prickled with warning. Something wasn't right. He signaled for the girls to stop motioning them into the shadow of a large boulder while he investigated. 20 yards ahead, the canyon widened into a small clearing. Mason advanced cautiously, rifle-ready senses alert for any disturbance. The smell hit him first, the unmistakable stench of death baking under the desert sun. Then, and as he rounded a bend in the canyon wall, he saw them bodies scattered across the clearing, their blue uniforms stark against the red earth. A cavalry patrol, or what remained of one. 8 men and their mounts cut down in what appeared to have been a swift, coordinated attack. The bodies had been stripped of weapons and valuables, but otherwise left untouched a message to any who might find them. Mason knelt beside the nearest soldier, examining the fatal wound. An arrow through the heart, delivered with such force it had penetrated the man's uniform and lodged deep in his chest. Not a random raid by opportunistic warriors, but a planned ambush, executed with military precision. A sound behind him made Mason whirl, rifle raised only to find Winona standing at the edge of the clearing. Her dark eyes took in the scene with disturbing composure. "You shouldn't be seeing this," Mason said, lowering his weapon. "Go back to your sister." Winona ignored him, moving among the bodies with the detachment of someone far older. "Wakaza's warriors," she said, pointing to distinctive markings on one of the arrows. "They protect sacred lands." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the canyon's shade. Wakaza was a name he knew well, a legendary Apache war chief who had eluded capture for years, orchestrating some of the most devastating attacks on military outposts and settlements throughout the territory. "You know of Wakaza?" he asked carefully. Winona's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, pride perhaps, or caution. "All Apache know Wakaza. Great chief, great warrior." Mason studied the girl with new attention. Was there more to her knowledge than simple tribal pride? Before he could question further, a glint of metal caught his eye, a lieutenant's insignia, on the uniform of one of the dead soldiers. Moving closer, Mason turned the body enough to see the man's face. Lieutenant Davis. Mason had served with him briefly at Fort Buchanan, a competent officer with a reputation for fairness. Now he lay dead in a nameless canyon, another casualty in an endless war. As Mason straightened, he noticed something clutched in the lieutenant's hand, a crumpled piece of paper stained with blood, but still legible. He pried it from the stiffening fingers and smoothed it open. It was an order signed by Captain Hargrove himself, directing Lieutenant Davis to pursue and capture the deserter Mason Carter, to be returned to Fort Buchanan for immediate court-martial and execution. The date indicated the order had been issued just 5 days ago. Mason's blood ran cold. Hargrove hadn't given up the hunt, and if this patrol had been following his trail, others would not be far behind. He turned to find Winona watching him intently. "We need to move," he said, tucking the paper into his pocket. "Now." "Why, what paper, say?" "Nothing good. There may be more soldiers nearby." Winona's eyes narrowed. "Paper about you." Mason hesitated, then nodded. No point lying when the girl was perceptive enough to read his reaction. "Yes, the soldiers were looking for me." "Why, I told you I ran away, deserted. That makes me a criminal to them." Winona digested this information, her young face grave with consideration. "You shoot your chief." The question caught Mason off guard. "What makes you think that Apache warriors only hunt their own if great betrayal happens, if man kills chief or steals from tribe?" She gestured to the bodies around them. "These men hunt you hard, like you do something very bad. Her logic was sound, her insight unsettling for one so young. Mason found himself unwilling to lie to those solemn eyes that had already seen too much truth. "Yes," he admitted, "I shot my commanding officer. He ordered us to kill unarmed Apache who came to talk peace. I refused." Winona's expression didn't change, but something in her posture eased slightly. "You shot him dead." "No, in the leg. Enough to stop him, not enough to kill." She seemed to find this distinction important, nodding slowly. "We go now. Take different path to avoid more bluecoats." As they retreated from the clearing, Mason cast one last glance at the fallen soldiers. They had died never knowing they were pawns in Hargrove's personal vendetta, for the captain's pursuit of Mason went beyond military discipline. It was hatred pure and simple, born the moment Mason's bullet tore through his leg and undermined his authority in front of the entire company. Winona led them on a new route, one that curved farther west, before turning south again. The detour would add miles to their journey, but Mason agreed with the caution. If one patrol had found its end in these canyons, others would be searching for them, and might find Mason's small party in the process. They traveled in tense silence, Mason alert for any sign of pursuit or ambush. Winona kept Kaya close, the younger girl moving with the same mechanical detachment that had characterized her since the wolf attack. Yet Mason noticed she no longer stared emptily ahead. Her eyes now tracked their surroundings, registering details of the landscape they traversed. By late afternoon, they had reached a small seep spring nestled among rocks, barely enough to fill their water skin, but a welcome find nonetheless. While Winona tended to this vital task, Mason checked their back trail from a high vantage point, confirming they were still alone in this vast wilderness. When he returned to the spring, he found Kaya kneeling in the damp sand, drawing with a small stick. The child had created an intricate pattern of connected lines and circles similar to the designs Mason had seen in Apache basket weaving. "That's very good," he said softly, crouching nearby. Kaya didn't respond verbally, but her drawing stick paused momentarily, acknowledging his presence. "Is it a map?" he asked, noting how some of the lines resembled watercourses. Winona approached water skin refilled. "It is story," she explained. "Old story about first man and first woman, how they found water in dry land." She spoke rapid Apache to her sister, who resumed drawing, adding new elements to the pattern. "She remembers stories," Winona continued. "Grandfather told many stories. Kaya remembers all." Mason nodded, encouraged by this sign of the younger girl's internal life continuing despite her trauma. "Stories are important," he said. "They help us remember who we are." "What stories you remember?" Winona asked unexpectedly. The question caught Mason unprepared. What stories did he carry? Not the noble tales of cavalry glory he'd been fed as a young recruit. Not the sanitized history of westward expansion taught in Eastern schools. "I remember true stories," he said finally, "about people I've met, things I've seen, some good, some—" He trailed off, unwilling to burden the children with the darker narratives that populated his memory. Winona seemed to understand the unspoken. "Some stories too heavy to carry," she agreed, "but must not forget, or they happen again." The wisdom in her words, the understanding that history forgotten was history, repeated, struck Mason with its simple truth. This child, not yet in her teens, grasped what generals and politicians willfully ignored. As darkness fell, they made camp in a sheltered hollow, risking a small fire to ward off the desert night's penetrating chill. Mason used the opportunity to check and clean his weapons, a ritual that brought comfort in its familiarity. Winona watched him work, her curiosity evident. "You good with gun," she observed. "Kill wolves fast, even with hurt shoulder." Mason nodded, accepting the compliment. "Had lots of practice. Not always proud of that. You teach me, she asked suddenly. To shoot better. My grandfather start teaching, but… She glanced at the empty rifle propped against a rock. I miss wolves. Waste bullets. Mason considered the request. Teaching a young Apache girl to better use weapons against his former comrades carried a weight of irony he couldn't ignore. Yet, in this dangerous territory, such skills might mean the difference between life and death for her and her sister. Yes, he decided. I'll teach you, when we find more ammunition. Winona nodded, satisfied with the promise. She turned her attention to preparing their meager evening meal, the last of the dried meat shared between them, with the silent understanding that they would need to find food tomorrow or go hungry. As they ate, Mason found himself studying the pattern on Winona's neckcloth, the same design etched into his obsidian arrow point. In the firelight, the symbols seemed almost alive, shifting with each flicker of flame. Your neckcloth, he said, gesturing to the article. The pattern is unusual. Winona's hand went to the cloth fingers, tracing its design with reverence. Medicine symbol, she explained. Very old, very powerful. Protect wearer from evil spirits. Where did you get it? Mother make for me. She say it family mark passed down many generations. Winona tilted her head, curiosity bright in her eyes. Why, you ask? Mason hesitated, then reached for his leather pouch. Because I have this. He unwrapped the obsidian arrow point and held it in his palm, where the firelight caught its polished surface. Winona's intake of breath was sharp and immediate. She stared at the arrow point, then at Mason's shock, evident in her expression. Where you get this? She demanded, voice suddenly tense. An old Apache medicine man gave it to me 5 years ago. I saved him from drowning in a flash flood. Mason turned the arrow point, letting her see the symbols clearly. He said it would find its rightful owner someday. Winona reached out slowly, her small fingers hovering over the artifact without touching it. This is sacred thing, she whispered. Very powerful medicine. Very old. She looked up at Mason, her expression a mixture of awe and suspicion. Medicine man, who give this he have white in hair here. She touched her temple. Mason nodded, surprised. Yes, white streaks at his temples, tall for an Apache, with a scar across his cheek. Winona sat back, visibly shaken. That is Nahimana, great healer, wisest elder. She swallowed hard, then added in a voice barely above a whisper, My grandfather. Mason stared at her, the implications landing like physical blows. Your grandfather? But that would mean… Nahimana is father of my mother, Winona confirmed. He died 2 winters ago, but before he speak of white soldier who save him from angry water. Say the man have good heart, under blue coat. The coincidence was too perfect, too complete, to be mere chance. Mason carefully rewrapped the arrow point, his mind racing with questions. Did he tell you why he gave me this? What it means? Winona shook her head. Grandfather keep many secrets. Say some knowledge only for right time, right person. She studied Mason with new intensity. But now you hear with his arrow medicine helping his granddaughters, this cannot be accident. No, Mason agreed softly. I don't believe it is. They fell silent, the implications of their connection hanging in the air between them. If Nahimana had been Winona's grandfather, that meant their destination, the hidden canyon where her mother waited, was the home of the medicine man's daughter. A woman who might know why Mason carried this sacred artifact and what obligation came with it. As the fire burned down to embers, Mason took first watch again, his thoughts too turbulent for sleep. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the small dramas playing out beneath them. Yet Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something larger than himself was at work here, some pattern being woven that he could sense but not yet see clearly. The arrow finds its owner, Nahimana had said. Blood debt will be paid, and your soul healed. Words that had seemed merely mystical now carried the weight of prophecy. Mason's hand moved unconsciously to his wounded shoulder. The infection had receded further under Winona's care, the pain dulled to a manageable ache. Physical healing was underway, but the deeper wounds, the ones that bled inside, where no one could see, those remained, as raw as the day they were inflicted at Eagle Canyon. Perhaps he thought, as he watched the sleeping children, those wounds were why he was here. Not by chance, but by design, drawn to this place. These people by forces beyond his understanding, but not beyond his choice to accept. Whatever awaited them in the hidden canyon, Mason was now certain of one thing: his journey with these children was meant to be, and he would see it through wherever it led. Dawn broke with the promise of another scorching day. They set out early, hoping to cover significant ground before the worst heat descended. Their supplies were dangerously low water for perhaps one more day, no food remaining. Mason knew they would need to find both soon if they were to complete their journey. Winona led them with increasing confidence, now pointing out landmarks only she could recognize in the seemingly featureless landscape. They had entered a region of broken mesas and hidden watercourses where natural features created a labyrinth, navigable only to those who knew its secrets. 2 more days, she said, as they paused in the shade of a towering rock formation. If we keep good pace. Mason nodded, conserving his strength and words in the oppressive heat. His shoulder wound continued to improve, but hunger and thirst were taking their toll on all of them. Kaya especially looked wan, her small face drawn with exhaustion. As they rested, Mason noticed movement on a distant ridge, a flicker of something that didn't belong among the static rocks and sparse vegetation. He raised his hand for silence, eyes narrowed against the sun's glare. There it was again, a flash of metal catching sunlight. A rifle barrel, or perhaps field glasses, scanning the terrain. "Someone's watching us," he murmured to Winona. "Up there on the north ridge." The girl followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Apache scout, maybe. Or bluecoat. Can't tell from here, but we should assume they've seen us and move accordingly." Mason considered their options. "Is there a more sheltered route we can take?" Winona hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, through shadow canyons, harder path, but hidden from above." "Lead the way." They abandoned their rest spot, moving deeper into the maze of rock formations. Winona guided them into a narrow slot canyon barely wide enough for an adult to pass through sideways. The temperature dropped noticeably as they entered its shadowed confines, the high walls blocking direct sunlight. For nearly an hour, they followed this natural corridor as it twisted and turned through the earth. At times, it widened enough to walk comfortably. At others, they were forced to squeeze through gaps that seemed impossibly tight. Throughout, Mason kept alert for signs of pursuit, but the canyon's acoustics made it difficult to distinguish distant sounds from nearby echoes. Finally, they emerged into a wider space, a box canyon with sheer walls on 3 sides, and their slot canyon providing the only visible entrance or exit. A small spring bubbled from the base of the northern wall, feeding a pool of clear water surrounded by lush vegetation that seemed miraculous after the barren terrain they'd traversed. "We rest here," Winona decided. "Eat, drink, then go when sun lower." Mason agreed, his body crying out for sustenance and rest. They refilled the water skin, then Winona showed him which plants were edible small tubers growing near the spring prickly pear pads that could be stripped of spines and eaten raw, and tiny tart berries clustered on low bushes. It wasn't much, but after days of near starvation, it tasted like a feast. Even Kaya seemed to revive somewhat her movements, becoming more purposeful as she helped gather the berries. As they ate, Mason kept watch on the canyon entrance, still uneasy about the observer he'd spotted earlier. "We should move on before dark," he said. "If that was a scout, they'll have reported our position by now." Winona nodded, her expression serious. "Shadow canyons have many turns. Easy to get lost if you don't know way. Good place for—" She searched for the English word. "Ambush. Exactly what I was thinking." Mason checked his ammunition, 3 rounds left for the Winchester, 2 for the Colt. Not enough for a prolonged engagement. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. They had just finished gathering their few possessions when a sound froze them in place, the distant but distinctive whinny of a horse. Then another, followed by the muffled jingle of tack and equipment. Riders approaching. Whether Apache or cavalry remained to be seen, but either would present danger to their small party. Mason signaled for the girls to take cover behind a large boulder near the spring. He positioned himself closer to the canyon entrance, rifle ready, but not yet raised. Better to assess the situation before revealing hostile intent. The sounds grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls in confusing patterns. One rider, perhaps 2, moving carefully through the slot canyon. Mason steadied his breathing, years of training taking over as he prepared for whatever emerged. First came the horse, a cavalry mount by its breeding and tack, but riderless, its reins trailing loose. It entered the box canyon hesitantly, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of water. Behind it came a second horse, this one bearing a rider in the unmistakable uniform of a U.S. cavalry officer. Even before the man's face came into view, Mason recognized the set of those shoulders, the precise way he held himself in the saddle. Captain Hargrove, the man who had ordered the massacre at Eagle Canyon, who had put a bullet in Mason's shoulder as he fled, who had hunted him across the territory with the persistence of a man possessed. Mason's finger tensed on the trigger, a clean shot presenting itself. One squeeze, and it would be over. The pursuit ended, the threat eliminated. Justice of a sort for the Apache who had died under Hargrove's orders. But Hargrove wasn't alone. As the captain guided his mount into the wider space of the box canyon, a third horse appeared carrying a rider that made Mason's blood run cold. It was a young Apache warrior, hands bound before him, a rope around his neck connecting to Hargrove's saddle. The prisoner's face was bruised and bloodied, but his bearing remained proud despite his captive state. Mason held his fire, the situation now infinitely more complex. A shot might kill Hargrove, but it would also leave the Apache prisoner in deadly peril, possibly dragged to death if the captain's horse bolted. From his position, Mason could see Winona peering around the boulder, her eyes wide with recognition and horror. She made a small, choked sound that she quickly stifled with her hand. Hargrove reined in his mount near the spring, apparently unaware of their presence. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a lifelong horseman, keeping the rope to his prisoner taut. "Water, the horses," he ordered the Apache in heavily accented English. "Then yourself. We've ground to cover before nightfall." The warrior complied silently, leading the animals to the spring. As he knelt to drink himself, Hargrove kept the rope tight, forcing the Apache to bend awkwardly. "Drink well," the captain said, his voice carrying clearly in the canyon's natural acoustics. "It may be your last, unless you decide to be more cooperative about the location of Wakiza's camp." The warrior said nothing, maintaining a dignity that seemed to further irritate Hargrove. The captain yanked on the rope, bringing the Apache up short. "Your friends weren't so silent before they died," Hargrove continued. "Lieutenant Davis extracted quite detailed information from one of them, enough to lead us right to the hidden canyon. All I need from you is confirmation we're on the right path." Still, the warrior remained silent, though his eyes blazed with hatred and something else, fear perhaps, but not for himself. Fear for what Hargrove's words implied. Mason watched, mind racing. If Hargrove was telling the truth, if he had extracted information about the hidden canyon's location, then the girl's mother and her people were in imminent danger. The captain wouldn't be traveling alone. He would have a full detachment nearby waiting for his scout report. The realization hit Mason with sickening clarity. Hargrove wasn't just hunting him. The captain was leading a major operation against Wakaza's band, using Mason's trail as an excuse, or perhaps convenient cover for his true objective. Mason needed to warn the Apache settlement, but to do that he needed to deal with Hargrove first. And to do that without endangering the bound warrior required perfect timing and execution. He began to ease backward, intending to circle around behind Hargrove while the captain was distracted with watering the horses. But his boot dislodged a small stone that clattered across the rocky ground. Hargrove whirled his hand, dropping to his sidearm with practiced speed. "Who's there?" he demanded, drawing his revolver. "Show yourself!" Mason froze, calculating options that dwindled with each passing second. Before he could act, however, the situation changed dramatically. Winona stepped out from behind the boulder, hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender. "Please don't shoot," she called in her accented English. "We just children lost." Hargrove's attention shifted to the girl, surprise evident in his expression. An Apache child out here alone. "Not alone," Winona said, her voice steady despite the danger. "With sister. Our grandparents die. We try to find mother." The captain's surprise gave way to calculating interest. "Where is your sister?" Winona gestured toward the boulder. "There. She's scared. Please don't hurt us." Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come out, child. I won't harm you. In fact, I might be able to help you find your mother." Mason recognized the lie for what it was. Hargrove had no intention of helping these children. They were potential leverage against Wakaza's band, or at worst, examples to be made. As Kaya reluctantly emerged from hiding, Mason made his decision. He stepped into view, Winchester raised and aimed squarely at Hargrove's chest. "Let the children go, Captain," he said, his voice steady, despite the hammering of his heart. "This is between you and me." Hargrove's head snapped toward him, shock giving way to a cold smile of satisfaction. "Carter, I knew you'd turn up eventually." His revolver remained trained on Winona. "Lower your weapon, or the girl dies first." A standoff with two children caught in the middle. Mason kept his rifle level, mind racing through scenarios, none of them good. "You're not leaving this canyon, Hargrove," he said. "Not after what you did at Eagle Canyon, not after what you're planning to do to these people." The captain's smile widened. "Still playing the righteous defender of savages, I see. Did you know your little friends here are the granddaughters of Wakaza himself?" "Oh yes," he continued, noting Mason's carefully controlled reaction. "Lieutenant Davis was quite thorough in his interrogation before those Apache warriors killed him. The great chief's daughter is dying of a mysterious ailment, and these children were sent to find medicine." Mason's gaze flicked to Winona, whose expression confirmed Hargrove's words. The revelation struck him with physical force. Not just any Apache children, but the family of Wakiza, the most hunted, most feared war chief in the territory. And if Winona's mother was Wakaza's daughter, then that meant the old medicine man Nahimana had been Wakiza's father-in-law. The connection spun out in Mason's mind, pieces falling into place with dizzying speed. Hargrove misinterpreted his silence. "Surprised you should be. These little savages and their mother are our ticket to finally ending Wakiza's reign of terror. A shame you won't live to see it." His finger tightened on the trigger. What happened next occurred so quickly that Mason would later struggle to piece together the sequence of events. The bound Apache warrior suddenly lunged, driving his shoulder into Hargrove's side. The captain's shot went wide, the bullet ricocheting off canyon walls. Mason fired his round, catching Hargrove in the upper arm, spinning him, but not dropping him. Winona grabbed Kaya and dove for cover as both men fired again. Hargrove's shot grazing Mason's already wounded shoulder, Mason's bullet missing entirely as he ducked behind a boulder. The Apache warrior had fallen during the initial exchange. The rope around his neck pulled tight as Hargrove's horse shied away from the gunfire. He lay gasping, struggling against his bonds. "Carter!" Hargrove shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You're only delaying the inevitable, that wound in your shoulder, my bullet, if I'm not mistaken. How's the infection? Not looking too good, I'd wager." Mason pressed against the boulder, blood seeping through his reopened wound. 3 shots left between his weapons. Hargrove would have a full cylinder in his revolver, plus whatever long arm he carried on his saddle. "The girls are going to die, Carter." Hargrove continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow made his words more chilling. "And so is their mother and every other savage in that hidden canyon. The only question is whether you die with them or live long enough to stand trial for treason." Mason glanced toward where Winona and Kaya huddled behind a fallen log near the spring. The older girl caught his eye, then pointed urgently toward the bound warrior still struggling for breath as the rope constricted his airway. A diversion. That's what they needed. Something to draw Hargrove's attention while Mason got a clear shot. As if reading his thoughts, Winona suddenly darted from cover, racing toward the warrior. Hargrove swung his revolver toward her, but before he could fire, a small stone struck him in the back of the head, thrown by Kaya, who had emerged from hiding on the opposite side. The momentary distraction was all Mason needed. He stepped out from behind the boulder, rifle raised, and fired in one smooth motion. The shot caught Hargrove square in the chest, driving him backward. The captain's revolver discharged as he fell, the bullet harmlessly embedding itself in the canyon floor. In the sudden silence that followed, Mason approached cautiously, rifle trained on Hargrove's motionless form. The captain's eyes stared sightlessly at the canyon sky, a look of surprise forever frozen on his features. Winona had reached the bound warrior and was struggling to loosen the rope around his neck. Mason quickly moved to help, using his knife to cut through the tough hemp. The warrior gasped as pressure released, drawing ragged breaths into oxygen-starved lungs. "Thank you," he managed in accented English, rubbing his abraded neck. Mason nodded, then turned to the girls. "Are you both all right?" Winona was already checking Kaya for injuries, her small hands moving with practiced efficiency. "We not hurt?" she confirmed. "But you are?" She pointed to Mason's shoulder, where fresh blood soaked his shirt. Before he could respond, the warrior spoke again, this time in Apache. Winona's head snapped up, her expression shifting from relief to shock. "What did he say?" Mason asked. He say we must run, now." Winona's voice trembled slightly. "Captain, not alone. Many soldiers follow not far behind, coming to attack our home." The warrior nodded grimly, switching to English. "2 days ago, they captured 3 of our scouts. Torture them for information about Hidden Canyon." His face darkened with grief. "One break under pain, tell them enough to find way. Captain, ride ahead to confirm path." Mason helped the man to his feet. "What's your name?" "Ahote," the warrior replied. "I track Captain after he kill my brothers. He capture me when I sleep." "How many soldiers in the main force?" Mason asked, already calculating odds and options. "Many. Maybe 30-40. Ahota's expression was grim. "They have big guns, cannon. Artillery. Hargrove wasn't planning a raid. He was mounting a full military assault on the hidden canyon. With that kind of firepower, the Apache settlement wouldn't stand a chance. How far behind? Mason pressed. Half-day's ride. They wait for Captain's signal before final approach. Mason made a swift decision. Winona, you and Kaya go with Ahote. Take the fastest route to warn your people. I'll slow down the soldiers. Winona's eyes widened. How you one man? They many. I know these army operations. I can create confusion, delay them long enough for your people to prepare or evacuate. Mason checked Hargrove's body, appropriating the captain's revolver and ammunition. Besides, I have a score to settle with this particular unit. Ahote studied Mason with new respect. You are the one who refused to fire at Eagle Canyon. The soldier who shot his own chief. Mason nodded, surprised. The warrior knew this detail. Word travels fast. Among Apache, yes. Ahote extended his hand in the white man's gesture of alliance. Today we fight same enemy. Mason clasped the offered hand, sealing their temporary pact. As they prepared to part ways, Winona approached him, her young face solemn. You have grandfather's arrow medicine, she said. It protects you. Mason touched the leather pouch at his side. I hope you're right. When you finish with soldiers come to Hidden Canyon, follow star path I show you. She pointed out a specific constellation, then traced its pattern in relation to a distant mountain peak. This lead you true. I'll find you, Mason promised, though whether he would survive to fulfill that promise remained uncertain. Kaya, silent throughout the encounter, suddenly moved forward and pressed something into Mason's hand, a small woven cord with 3 knots similar to those used by Apache children for counting. For luck, Winona translated. She say you are circle in our story now, must come back to finish drawing. The simple gesture from the traumatized child struck Mason with unexpected force. He carefully tucked the cord into his shirt pocket close to his heart. I'll do my best, he said softly. With no further words needed, they parted Ahote, leading the girls deeper into the shadow canyons toward their hidden home, Mason mounting Hargrove's horse to ride out and confront the approaching soldiers. As he guided the animal back through the slot canyon, Mason found himself pondering Winona's words. You are circle in our story now. The idea that he, a former enemy, had become part of these children's narrative, their circle of connection, felt significant in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The obsidian arrow point rested against his side, a tangible link to a past he hadn't lived and a future he couldn't yet see clearly. But, for the first time since Eagle Canyon, Mason felt something like purpose guiding his actions. Whether that purpose led to redemption or destruction remained to be seen. But he would ride toward it willingly, the faces of 2 Apache children fixed in his mind like stars by which to navigate the darkness ahead. Mason rode hard through the gathering dusk, Hargrove's horse responding well to his experienced handling. The animal was cavalry-trained and battle-tested, barely flinching when Mason occasionally discharged his rifle into the air, the beginning of his plan to confuse and delay the approaching soldiers. He had studied the terrain carefully before leaving the box canyon, identifying the most likely approach route for a large military force. Now he positioned himself on a ridge overlooking that path, watching as the first scouts from the main detachment appeared in the distance. Even from this range, Mason could make out the distinctive blue uniforms and military precision of their movements. 2 scouts riding ahead of the main force, followed by what appeared to be a full company of cavalry with pack mules carrying supplies, and most concerning of all, the disassembled parts of a mountain howitzer. Ahote hadn't exaggerated. This wasn't a pursuit party hunting a deserter. It was a full military assault on the hidden Apache settlement with enough firepower to reduce it to rubble. Mason checked Hargrove's revolver, now holstered at his hip, alongside his own nearly empty Colt. The captain's weapon was fully loaded, giving him 6 additional shots. Combined with his remaining rifle rounds, he had enough ammunition to create chaos, but not enough for a prolonged engagement. He would need to be strategic, to use fear and confusion rather than direct confrontation. To become, in essence, what the military most feared when operating in Apache territory, an unseen enemy striking from nowhere, vanishing before retaliation could be organized. Darkness was his ally now. As full night descended, Mason began implementing his plan. He circled wide around the soldiers' likely camping spot, approaching from the direction opposite to the hidden canyon. Finding a position on a rocky outcrop with good acoustics, he fired a single shot, then quickly relocated before the sound had finished echoing. The effect was immediate. The military column halted, scouts racing back to report, officers shouting orders. Mason moved again, circling to another position, and fired twice more in rapid succession. Now the soldiers were deploying defensively, sending out search parties preparing for what they believed might be an Apache ambush. Mason continued his one-man deception, firing from different locations, creating the illusion of multiple attackers converging on the unit. Between shots, he worked to further disrupt their operation, sneaking close enough to startle their horses, dislodging rocks to create alarming sounds in the darkness, leaving footprints suggesting Apache warriors were circling their position. It was dangerous work. Twice he nearly stumbled into search parties, combing the area for the phantom attackers. Once a volley of return fire came close enough that he felt the heat of a bullet passing near his face. But the night concealed him, and his intimate knowledge of military protocols allowed him to anticipate the soldiers' movements. By midnight, the unit had made minimal progress, bogged down in defensive postures against an enemy that didn't exist. They had established a fortified camp well short of their intended position, posting double sentries and keeping half the men on alert at all times. Mason allowed himself a grim smile of satisfaction as he observed their camp from a hidden vantage point. Every hour they remained stationary was another hour for the Apache settlement to prepare or evacuate. But he knew this delay tactic wouldn't work indefinitely. Once dawn came, the soldiers would realize they faced a single opponent, not a war party. He needed something more permanent to halt their advance. Moving carefully in the darkness, Mason worked his way around to the eastern side of their camp, where the pack animals were corralled. The mules carrying the howitzer parts were his primary target. Without that artillery, the soldiers would lose much of their advantage against the hidden canyon's natural defenses. The corral was guarded by 2 sentries, both alert and scanning the darkness with nervous intensity. Mason studied their patrol pattern, identifying the brief window when both men would have their backs turned. Then he crept forward silent as the desert predators he had learned to emulate during his scouting days. 20 yards from the corral, Mason froze as one sentry paused, head cocked as if hearing something. The soldier raised his rifle, peering into the darkness where Mason lay motionless against the earth. For a moment, discovery seemed inevitable. Then a nightbird called from a nearby mesa, drawing the sentry's attention in another direction. The moment passed. The sentries resumed their pattern. Mason continued his approach. At the edge of the corral, he paused again, weighing options. Simply releasing the animals would create temporary confusion, but wouldn't permanently disable the mission. The howitzer parts could be recovered, the advance resumed. No, he needed to ensure those artillery pieces never reached the hidden canyon. With careful movements, Mason slipped among the pack animals, locating the mules bearing the distinctive crates of howitzer components. Working by touch in the darkness, he found the securing straps and loosened them just enough that a startled animal might shed its burden. Then from his saddlebag he retrieved a small flask of coal oil he'd taken from Hargrove's supplies. This he sprinkled lightly across the howitzer crates, careful not to leave a scent trail back to his position. The final element of his plan was the most dangerous. Mason needed to create enough chaos to scatter the mules, preferably in multiple directions, while also igniting the oil-soaked crates. And he needed to do it without getting himself killed in the process. He retreated to the perimeter of the camp, circling until he found what he needed, a fallen branch of sufficient size to serve as a makeshift torch. Wrapping one end with a strip of cloth torn from his shirt, he created a primitive but functional firebrand. Position was critical now. Mason found a spot where the terrain offered both clear lines to the corral and a protected route for his own escape. He unwrapped Kaya's small knotted cord from his pocket, running it between his fingers for a moment. The child's gift seemed to focus his resolve, reminding him exactly what was at stake. With deliberate calm, Mason lit the torch using flint and steel from his possibles bag. The cloth caught quickly flames, illuminating his position in the darkness. He had seconds now before the sentries spotted the light. Raising his rifle with his free hand, Mason aimed at a point just above the corral and fired. Before the echo faded, he hurled the burning torch in a high arc that sent it spinning through the night to land directly among the pack animals. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Mules brayed in terror, rearing and kicking as the sudden fire ignited their animal fear. The corral fence, never designed to contain panicked beasts, gave way under their collective weight. Pack animals scattered in all directions, dragging and dropping their burdens as they fled. And exactly as Mason had hoped, the oil-soaked crates caught fire flames, spreading quickly among the dry wood and canvas covers. Soldiers shouted in alarm, rushing toward the expanding chaos. Officers bellowed contradictory orders: secure the animals, extinguish the fires, search for attackers. In the confusion, no one noticed Mason slipping away into the darkness, putting distance between himself and the camp before the inevitable organized response. From a ridge half a mile distant, he watched as the howitzer crates burned brightly ammunition, occasionally cooking off with sharp cracks that further fueled the panic. By the time the soldiers managed to extinguish the flames, the critical components would be warped beyond repair, the precision machinery ruined by heat. The mission to attack the hidden canyon with artillery support was effectively neutralized. The soldiers might still advance, but without the howitzer, they would face a much more even fight against the Apache defenders. Mason allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction before turning his horse eastward. He had bought time and reduced the threat, but he had also guaranteed that every soldier in that camp would now be hunting him with renewed determination. His best chance was to circle wide around their position and approach the hidden canyon from an unexpected direction. As he rode through the night, his thoughts turned to Winona and Kaya. Had they reached safety? Would their warning be heeded in time? And what of their mother? Wakiza's daughter reportedly dying of some mysterious ailment. The connections still bewildered him, that he should carry an artifact from the girl's grandfather, that he should find them precisely when they needed him most, that their destination should be the very place where answers to his own spiritual questions might lie. Coincidence seemed an inadequate explanation. Dawn found Mason in unfamiliar territory, having pushed both himself and his horse to the limits of endurance. The mountain range loomed closer now, its peaks catching the first light, while shadows still cloaked the canyons and valleys below. He allowed the horse a brief rest near a small seep spring, taking the opportunity to check his wounds. The shoulder injury had reopened during the night's activities, blood caking his shirt. The wolf bite on his arm throbbed with dull persistence. Exhaustion pulled at him like a physical weight, his body demanding rest that circumstances wouldn't allow. Somewhere ahead lay the hidden canyon, and with it, the end of this strange journey for good or ill. Mason tried to recall Winona's directions, the star path she had traced against the mountain peaks. But daylight obscured the stars, and the unfamiliar terrain offered few recognizable landmarks. He was lost, a condition he had rarely experienced during his years as a scout. The irony wasn't lost on him to have come so far, risked so much, only to fail because he couldn't find his destination. As Mason prepared to continue his journey, hoping to find some sign or marker that might guide him, a movement on a distant ridge caught his attention. He froze, hand dropping to Hargrove's revolver. A lone figure stood silhouetted against the morning sky, too far to identify clearly but unmistakably, watching him. Then, just as Mason began to wonder if he was spotted, the figure raised an arm in what appeared to be a deliberate signal. Mason hesitated, weighing the possibility of a trap against the equal possibility of assistance. After a moment's consideration, he raised his own arm in response. The figure immediately disappeared from the ridgeline. Mason remained where he was, alert for any sign of threat or approach. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then, from a different direction entirely, came the soft sound of hoofbeats. Mason turned to see a rider approaching at an unhurried pace, an Apache warrior mounted on a paint pony, carrying no visible weapons, but moving with the confident grace of someone in their element. As the rider drew closer, Mason was surprised to recognize Ahota, the warrior he had freed from Hargrove's rope in the Box Canyon. "You live," Ahota observed as he reined in his pony a respectful distance away. "Good fighting." Mason nodded in acknowledgement of both the greeting and the compliment. The soldiers, "Still far behind. Fire destroy big gun. They argue now, some want continue, others want return to fort." Ahote's expression showed satisfaction. "You make good trouble for bluecoats." Did the girls reach safety? Mason asked the question that had occupied his thoughts throughout the night. "Yes, they arrived before sunrise. Warning given." Ahote studied Mason's blood-stained clothing with a critical eye. "You hurt bad." "I'll manage." Mason gestured toward the mountains. "I was trying to find my way to the hidden canyon, but I'm not familiar with this territory." Ahote seemed to weigh a decision, his dark eyes measuring Mason with careful deliberation. Finally, he nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "I take you," he said. "Wakiza wants to meet man who saves his granddaughters and burns soldier's big gun." The directness of the offer took Mason by surprise. "Just like that! You trust me to know the location of your hidden camp." Ahota's expression remained impassive, but something like humor flickered in his eyes. "You already know too much. Better to keep close watch than leave you wandering, maybe captured by soldiers." The logic was impeccable, if not entirely reassuring. Mason nodded his acceptance. "Lead on, then." Ahote turned his pony and set off at a pace that Mason's tired mount could match. They rode in silence for a time, the Apache warrior choosing paths that seemed random to Mason's eye, but clearly followed some pattern known to those familiar with the territory. As they traveled, Mason's curiosity about his guide grew. "You speak English well," he observed. Ahote glanced back. 3 years at White Man's School, Fort Buchanan." Mason raised an eyebrow in surprise. The practice of educating Apache children at military installations was relatively recent and seldom voluntary. "How did that happen?" "Soldiers take me when I am boy. Say teach me to be civilized." Ahote's tone remained neutral, but tension showed in the set of his shoulders. "I learn many things. How white men think, how they fight, how they lie." He looked directly at Mason. "Also learn not all white men same." The pointed addendum wasn't lost on Mason. "And then you returned to your people. Escape when 16 summers. Bring knowledge back to Wakiza. Ahote guided his pony around a treacherous section of trail. Now I scout, sometimes interpret when needed. Mason processed this information, understanding better why Ahote had been trusted to retrieve him. The warrior had experience with white men, could assess their character and intentions with knowledge many Apache lacked. "The girls," Mason said after another period of silence. "They said their mother is ill." Ahote nodded grimly. "Aponi sick many moons now. Great healer, but cannot heal self." "What kind of sickness?" Mason asked, recalling Winona's description of something like poison in the blood. "Begin after soldiers attack old village. Many get sick, same way fever dreams, blood from eyes, strength, leaving day by day." Ahote's expression darkened. "Most die quick. Aponi fight longer because of healing knowledge, but still failing." The description sent a chill through Mason. It sounded like no natural disease he had encountered during his years on the frontier. And the children were seeking medicine for her special plant that grows only on Sacred Mountain. Very powerful, very rare. Ahote shook his head. "But old ones say even this may not be enough now. Sickness too strong, too strange." They continued their journey in thoughtful silence, the trail growing steeper as they entered the mountain foothills. Mason's horse struggled on the incline, still tired from the night's exertions. Ahote noticed and slowed his pace accordingly, occasionally pointing out easier paths through the rugged terrain. By midday, they had reached a series of connected box canyons that seemed to lead nowhere, each ending in apparent dead ends of sheer rock. But Ahote navigated these with confidence, finding hidden passages and narrow trails invisible to untrained eyes. "Close now," he said as they entered a particularly narrow ravine with high walls that blocked the sun, creating perpetual twilight. "Must go on foot from here." They dismounted, leading their horses along a path barely wide enough for man and beast to traverse single file. The ravine twisted and turned, sometimes requiring them to squeeze through gaps that seemed impossibly tight. Throughout, Mason remained alert for signs of Apache sentries, but saw none, though he had no doubt they were being watched. Finally, the ravine opened slightly, revealing a solid rock face that appeared to completely block further progress. Ahote stopped before it. "Hidden canyon beyond," he explained. "Secret way through known only to our people." Mason studied the rock face skeptically. It showed no obvious opening, no crack or crevice large enough for a man to pass through. "I don't see a way." Ahote's expression remained impassive. "That is why it is secret." He secured both horses to a stunted pine growing from a crack in the ravine wall. "Follow close. Step only where I step." With that cryptic instruction, the Apache warrior approached the rock face, moving slightly to the left of center. When he reached it, instead of stopping, he simply continued forward and vanished. Mason blinked momentarily, disoriented. Then, moving carefully to the exact spot where Ahote had disappeared, he discovered the illusion. What appeared to be solid rock was actually a narrow passage, its entrance perfectly concealed by an optical trick of light and shadow, enhanced by the natural coloration of the stone. Following Ahote's path, Mason entered the hidden passage. It was barely wide enough for his shoulders, the walls close enough to touch on both sides. The floor descended at a steep angle, requiring careful footing on the smooth stone. Light diminished to near darkness before gradually strengthening again as the passage curved. And then, suddenly, the narrow confines opened out into a vista so unexpected and breathtaking that Mason stopped in his tracks, momentarily stunned by the transition. Before him stretched a hidden valley perhaps a mile across, completely encircled by sheer canyon walls that rose hundreds of feet on all sides. A clear stream wound through its center, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down the far wall in a silver ribbon. The valley floor was lush with vegetation stands of pine and cottonwood near the stream meadows of grass and wildflowers, even small cultivated fields where crops grew in neat rows. But most remarkable of all was the community itself. Dozens of traditional Apache shelters scattered along the stream and nestled among the trees, with people moving about their daily activities in this perfect natural fortress, hidden from the outside world. Ahote allowed Mason a moment to absorb the sight before speaking. "Welcome to Jiwigai," he said, using the Apache name, White Mountain Place. Mason nodded, understanding now why the army had never found this stronghold despite years of searching. Its natural defenses were formidable, its entrance nearly impossible to discover without a guide. Even if the soldiers had somehow learned its general location, they would have needed the howitzer to have any hope of breaching its walls. "It's remarkable," he said simply. Ahote gestured for Mason to follow. "Come, they wait for us." As they descended the path into the valley proper, Mason became acutely aware of the attention focusing on him from all directions. Apache men, women, and children paused in their activities to watch the white stranger entering their sanctuary, expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Mason kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. He had entered many Apache camps during his scouting days, but never as a guest, rather than an intruder. The difference was palpable in the atmosphere around him, tense, but not immediately dangerous. Ahote led him toward the center of the settlement, where a large shelter stood somewhat apart from the others. Outside it, a small group had gathered, apparently awaiting their arrival. Mason recognized Winona and Kaya immediately. The older girl stood tall and composed, though exhaustion showed in the shadows beneath her eyes. Beside her, Kaya remained silent as always, but her gaze fixed on Mason with what might have been relief. Next to the children stood an elderly Apache man, whose bearing and decorations marked him as a person of importance, perhaps a spiritual leader or elder. His weathered face showed a lifetime of hardship and wisdom, his eyes sharp and evaluating as they tracked Mason's approach. But it was the third adult who commanded Mason's immediate attention, a man in his 50s whose presence seemed to fill the space around him despite his complete stillness. He wore simple buckskins without elaborate decoration, but the eagle feather in his hair and the way others deferred to him left no doubt as to his identity. Wakiza, the most feared and respected Apache war chief, in the territory architect of dozens of successful raids against military outposts, protector of his people against the encroaching tide of white settlement. A man with a price on his head large enough to tempt even the most principled bounty hunter. And father of the woman Mason had come to find. Ahote stopped a respectful distance from the group and gestured for Mason to do the same. "Wakiza," he said in formal tones, "I bring the white man who saved your granddaughters and delayed the soldiers." The war chief studied Mason with penetrating intensity, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and measured, his English precise though heavily accented. "You bleed on our sacred ground, Mason Carter." The use of his full name was deliberate. Mason knew a demonstration that the Apache had sources of information beyond what Mason himself had revealed. "My apologies," he replied formally. "The wounds were earned in service to your family." Wakiza nodded, acknowledging both the response and the respect it conveyed. "My granddaughters tell interesting story. White soldier fights wolves to save Apache children, risks life against former brothers to protect our home." His dark eyes bored into Mason's. Why? It was the question Mason had asked himself throughout this journey. Why risk everything for children not of his blood, for people who had every reason to count him enemy? The answer that came to his lips surprised him with its simplicity and truth. Because it was right. Wakiza continued his assessment, as if searching for deception beneath the words. Finding none, he turned to the elderly man beside him, speaking rapidly in Apache. The elder responded in kind, occasionally gesturing toward Mason with gnarled hands. Winona edged closer to Mason during this exchange. "Grandfather asks about your medicine arrow," she whispered. "I tell him you have it." Mason nodded, his understanding hand moving instinctively to the leather pouch at his side. Finally, Wakiza turned back to him. "Show me what you carry." With careful movements, Mason withdrew the wrapped obsidian arrow point from its pouch. He unwound the soft buckskin, revealing the artifact that had traveled with him for 5 years, waiting for this moment. The elder stepped forward, his breath catching audibly when he saw the arrow point lying in Mason's palm. He spoke urgently to Wakiza, who listened with intense concentration before addressing Mason again. "You know what this is?" Mason shook his head. "Only that it was given to me by an Apache medicine man named Nahimana after I pulled him from a flash flood. He said it would find its rightful owner someday, and that when it did, a blood debt would be paid, and my soul healed." The elder spoke again more insistently. Wakiza nodded. "Nahimana was my wife's father," he confirmed. "A great healer and visionary. This arrow point you carry is very old, very sacred. It belongs to the lineage of healers in our family." Mason looked down at the obsidian artifact, its etched symbols seeming to shift in the daylight. "Then it belongs to your daughter, the children's mother, perhaps." Wakiza's expression revealed nothing. "First, we must decide what to do with you, Mason Carter. You have helped my family, this is true, but you are also former scout for Bluecoats, hunter of Apache." The reminder of his past hung in the air between them, unavoidable and undiminished by recent actions. "I cannot change what I was," Mason acknowledged. "Only what I am now and what I choose to be tomorrow." Something like approval flickered in Wakiza's eyes. "Wise words." He gestured toward Mason's wounds. "You need healing before we speak more. Ahote will show you where to rest. Tonight, we hold council to decide your fate." It was a diplomatic dismissal, neither promising acceptance nor threatening harm. Mason nodded his understanding, recognizing that he remained effectively a prisoner, albeit one being treated with unusual consideration. As Ahote led him away, Winona and Kaya followed a few paces behind. The Apache warrior brought them to a small shelter near the stream, somewhat removed from the main settlement. "Rest here," Ahote instructed. "Food and medicine come soon. Do not leave this place without escort." The warning was polite but unmistakable. After the warrior departed, Winona approached Mason directly. "You hurt bad," she asked, eyeing his blood-stained clothing. "Nothing that won't heal," Mason assured her, though in truth both his shoulder wound and the wolf bite on his arm had begun to throb with concerning intensity. "Are you two all right?" Winona nodded. "Safe now, but worried for Mother." Her young face showed the strain of recent days. "She very weak now. Sleeps most time." "I'm sorry," Mason said, meaning it. "Your grandfather, Wakiza, he seems like a strong leader. He'll find a way to help her." "Maybe." Winona's expression suggested she harbored doubts. "Grandfathers say old medicine not working against new sickness. Needs something stronger." Mason was about to ask more about this mysterious illness when a woman approached the shelter carrying a basket of supplies. She was perhaps 30, with the strong, capable look of someone accustomed to hard work. Her expression as she regarded Mason was neutral, but not openly hostile. "This is Taluta," Winona introduced her. "She help with healing when Mother too weak." The woman set down her basket and spoke to Winona in Apache. The girl translated. "She say you must remove shirt so she can see wounds." Mason complied, wincing as dried blood pulled at the injuries. Both his shoulder and forearm looked worse than he had expected, inflamed and swollen with angry red lines beginning to spread outward from the wound sites. Taluta examined him with clinical detachment, her hands gentle but thorough as she probed the injuries. She spoke again to Winona, who translated. "She say both wounds have bad spirit in them. Need strong medicine to clean out before it travels to your heart." Mason had seen enough infection during his military service to recognize the danger. "Tell her I appreciate her help." While Taluta worked cleaning the wounds with water from the stream and applying a poultice of crushed herbs that stung fiercely before producing blessed numbness, Mason watched Kaya. The younger girl had settled by the entrance of the shelter, silently drawing patterns in the dirt with a small stick, much as she had done during their journey. "Has she spoken yet?" he asked Winona quietly. The older girl shook her head. "Not since wolves, but she draw more now. Taluta say this good sign. Spirit still strong, just hiding inside." Mason nodded, understanding the concept in both Apache and Western terms, the mind retreating from trauma, finding safety in silence until healing could begin. When Taluta finished bandaging his wounds, she spoke again to Winona, her tone more conversational than professional. "She asked how you burn soldiers' big gun." Winona translated a hint of pride in her voice. "Word spread fast about what you do." Mason gave a simplified account of his night's work, which Winona translated with occasional clarifying questions from Taluta. The Apache woman's expression shifted from neutral to something approaching respect, as she understood the tactics he had employed. When the story concluded, Taluta spoke directly to Mason for the first time in halting but clear English. "You fight like Apache. Smart, not just strong." She gathered her medical supplies and stood. "Rest now. Wounds need sleep to heal." After she departed, Winona brought Mason a wooden bowl filled with some kind of stew, a simple mixture of beans, corn, and what might have been rabbit meat. Despite its plainness, it was the first real meal he had eaten in days, and he consumed it gratefully. "You should rest too," he told Winona when he had finished. "You've been through a lot." The girl nodded, fatigue evident in her posture. "We'll come back later, before council." She took Kaya's hand, guiding her sister away from her drawing. "Ahote watch outside. Keep you safe." The last part carried a hint of warning, a reminder that while he might be treated as a guest, he remained under guard. Left alone in the small shelter, Mason stretched out on the sleeping furs, provided his body embracing the opportunity for rest, despite the uncertainty of his situation. The herb poultice had dulled the pain of his wounds, and the simple meal had restored some of his strength. Yet questions continued to circle in his mind like restless birds. What would the council decide about his fate? What was the mysterious illness afflicting the children's mother? And most pressing of all, what was the significance of the obsidian arrow point he carried that it could command such respect from Wakaza and the tribal elder? Sleep claimed him before he could pursue these thoughts further, his exhausted body surrendering to healing darkness. Mason woke to the sound of voices outside the shelter, Ahote, speaking with someone whose responses came in a child's high, clear tones. It took him a moment to orient himself, to remember where he was and how he had come to be there. The hidden canyon. Wakiza's stronghold. A council to decide his fate. Light filtering through the shelter's entrance suggested late afternoon. He had slept for hours, his body demanding the rest needed to fight infection and recover from days of exertion. Moving carefully, he tested his wounds. The numbness from Taluta's poultice had faded, replaced by a dull throb that was nonetheless less fierce than before. The shelter flap moved aside, revealing Kaya standing in the entrance. The younger girl regarded him solemnly for a moment, then stepped inside carrying a small gourd vessel filled with water. Mason sat up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle the traumatized child. "Thank you, Kaya," he said softly as she placed the water within his reach. She didn't respond verbally, but neither did she immediately retreat. Instead, she settled cross-legged on the ground near the entrance, watching him with those dark, expressive eyes that communicated what her voice would not. Mason sipped the water, maintaining a calm, non-threatening presence. After a few minutes of this peaceful silence, Kaya reached for a small stick and began drawing in the dirt floor of the shelter, the same activity that seemed to comfort her throughout their journey. "What are you drawing?" Mason asked gently, not really expecting an answer. To his surprise, Kaya pointed to him, then back to her drawing. Mason leaned forward slightly to see better. The child had sketched a simple but recognizable figure of a man standing between what appeared to be wolves and two smaller human figures, a representation of their first meeting. "That's very good," he said, genuinely impressed by her ability to capture the essence of that night with such simple lines. "You have a gift for drawing." Kaya continued her work, adding details to the scene stars overhead, the overturned wagon, even small stick figures on the ground that Mason recognized with a pang as representations of her grandparents. The child was processing her trauma through art, recreating events too painful to speak of. Mason had seen similar behaviors in soldiers after particularly brutal battles. Some wrote letters. They never sent others carved elaborate designs into their rifle stocks, all seeking some way to externalize experiences too overwhelming to contain. As he watched, Kaya began a new drawing beside the first, this one showing what appeared to be their journey through the desert. Three figures walking in a line, mountains in the distance, a sun overhead. Again, the simplicity contained remarkable expressiveness, conveying not just events, but feelings, the smallness of people against the vastness of the landscape, the purposefulness of their movement toward a distant goal. "You're telling our story," Mason observed quietly. Kaya glanced up at him, then back to her drawing. She added a final element, a small circle that connected the two scenes, encompassing elements of both. Then, for the first time since he had met her, she spoke. "Circle." Her voice was soft, but clear, the single word carrying weight beyond its simple sound. Mason felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. This small breakthrough, this fragile return of voice, seemed like a precious gift, more meaningful than any council's approval could be. "Yes," he agreed solemnly. "We are part of the same circle now." Kaya nodded once, as if satisfied that he understood, then returned to her drawing, adding more details to the connected scenes. Outside, voices approached the shelter, Winona speaking with Ahote. The flap moved aside again, revealing the older girl dressed in what appeared to be her finest clothing, her hair freshly braided with beads woven through the strands. "Council ready," she announced. "You must come now." Mason rose carefully, mindful of his wounds. "Kaya spoke," he told Winona. "Just one word, but it's a start." Winona's eyes widened. She knelt beside her sister, speaking rapidly in Apache. Kaya didn't respond verbally again, but she pointed to her drawing, apparently communicating something important through the images. Winona studied the connected scenes, then looked up at Mason with new intensity. "She shows you in our circle, part of our story." The girl seemed both surprised and thoughtful. "This means something important. Must tell grandfather." Mason straightened his clothing as best he could, aware that his appearance before the council would influence their judgment. His shirt remained blood-stained despite attempts to clean it, but at least the fresh bandages Taluta had applied looked neat and professional. Outside, the hidden canyon was transformed by the golden light of approaching sunset. The sheer walls glowed amber and rose, while shadows lengthened across the valley floor. The Apache community had gathered near the central fire pit, forming a loose circle around what appeared to be a council area. Ahote led Mason toward this gathering, Winona and Kaya following close behind. As they approached, conversations quieted attention, focusing on the white stranger in their midst. At the head of the circle sat Wakiza, flanked by the elderly man Mason had seen earlier, and several other Apache who carried themselves with the dignity of respected leaders or warriors. Mason was directed to stand at the center of the gathering alone, but for Winona, who positioned herself nearby as translator. Wakiza spoke first, his deep voice carrying easily to the assembled community. He spoke in Apache, but frequently gestured toward Mason, clearly recounting the events that had brought the white man to their hidden sanctuary. When he finished, the elder beside him stood leaning on a gnarled walking stick for support. Unlike Wakiza, he addressed Mason directly in surprisingly fluent English. "I am Kichi, spiritual guide of our people," he introduced himself. "Wakiza has told of your deeds, saving the children, burning the soldiers' big gun, warning us of danger." The old man's penetrating gaze seemed to look through Mason rather than at him. "But we must know more, before we decide your place among us." Mason nodded his understanding, recognizing the formal nature of these proceedings. "Tell us of Eagle Canyon," Kichi continued. "What happened there that made you turn against your own kind?" The request struck at the heart of Mason's transformation, requiring him to revisit the darkest day of his life before this community of strangers. Yet he recognized the necessity they needed to understand who he was, what had driven him to this point before they could trust his presence among them. "I was a scout for the U.S. Cavalry." Mason began, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath his words. "For 8 years I tracked Apache movements, guided patrols, helped establish outposts on your lands." He paused, acknowledging the gravity of these admissions. "I believed I was serving a just cause, helping to bring peace to the territory." Murmurs rippled through the gathering at this, but Kichi raised a hand for silence. "Continue. 3 weeks ago, my unit received intelligence that a band of Apache wanted to discuss terms for peace. Our commander, Captain Hargrove, arranged a meeting at Eagle Canyon." Mason's jaw tightened at the memory. 7 Apache men came unarmed under a flag of truce. They were met by 20 soldiers with loaded rifles. The atmosphere in the circle grew tense, many present, likely aware of what followed. "Hargrove never intended to negotiate," Mason continued. "When the Apache spokesman began to speak, Hargrove gave the order to fire. 5 died immediately, 2 were wounded." He met Kichi's eyes directly. "I refused the order. When Hargrove threatened to have me shot for insubordination, I turned my weapon on him, wounded him in the leg before he could order the men to continue to the Apache camp, where women and children waited." Wakiza leaned forward slightly at this, his interest sharpened. "And then?" "Chaos. Some soldiers followed Hargrove's orders. Others hesitated. I took a bullet in the shoulder from Hargrove's gun and fled. I don't know if the Apache camp received warning in time to escape." Kichi and Wakiza exchanged a significant look. The war chief spoke briefly in Apache, which Winona translated for Mason. "He says they did escape. One of the wounded warriors managed to reach the camp with warning. Most got away before soldiers arrived." Relief washed through Mason, a weight he had carried for weeks suddenly lifted. Not all had died because of his delayed action. Some had survived. Kichi spoke again. "Why do you carry Nahimana's sacred arrow point? How did you come to possess it?" Mason recounted the story of saving the old medicine man from the flash flood of the strange gift and prophecy that accompanied it. As he spoke, He withdrew the obsidian artifact from its pouch, allowing its polished surface to catch the fading sunlight. I never fully understood its meaning, he concluded, only that it was important, and that someday it would find its rightful owner. Kichi nodded slowly. Nahimana was my brother's son, a great visionary and healer. This arrow point has been passed through generations of healers in our family, its origins lost to time. It is said to hold powerful medicine capable of curing even the most desperate illnesses when wielded by one with the gift. Mason looked down at the artifact resting in his palm. Then it should go to the children's mother, Wakiza's daughter. Winona says she's a healer and that she's gravely ill. A pony is indeed a great healer, Kichi confirmed. And yes, she suffers from a terrible sickness that resists all traditional remedies. The old man's expression grew troubled. But the arrow point alone is not enough. It requires special knowledge to unleash its healing power, knowledge that died with Nahimana. Before Mason could respond, a commotion at the edge of the gathering drew everyone's attention. A young Apache woman pushed through the crowd, her expression urgent as she spoke rapidly to Wakiza. The war chief rose immediately, his formal demeanor replaced by evident concern. He issued quick orders that sent several people hurrying away, then addressed the council. "We must suspend this judgment," Winona translated for Mason. "My daughter's condition has worsened suddenly. She asks for the white man and the medicine arrow." Mason didn't wait for formal permission. He stepped forward, the obsidian arrow point still in his hand. "Take me to her." Wakiza studied him for a brief moment, then nodded sharply. Without further ceremony, he led Mason through the dispersing crowd toward a shelter set slightly apart from the others, larger than most, with symbolic designs painted around its entrance that marked it as a place of healing. Inside, lit by the warm glow of a small fire, lay a woman whose resemblance to Winona was unmistakable despite the ravages of illness. She appeared to be in her early 30s, her once beautiful features now gaunt, and drawn, her skin bearing an unhealthy yellowish tinge. Her breathing came in labored gasps, and a sheen of sweat covered her forehead, despite the coolness of the evening. Kneeling beside her was Taluta, bathing her face with a cloth dipped in herbal-infused water. She looked up as they entered, her expression grave. "A pony," Wakiza said softly, kneeling beside his daughter. "I have brought him as you asked." The sick woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing the same intense dark gaze that Mason had seen in her daughter's. Despite her evident weakness, there was nothing diminished about the intelligence and will that shone from those eyes. "Mason Carter," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The soldier who saved my children." Mason knelt on her other side, struck by the formal beauty that illness had not entirely erased from her features. "Your daughters saved me as well," he said simply. A pony's gaze fixed on the obsidian arrow point in his hand. "My grandfather's medicine," she murmured. "He told me it would return when most needed." "It's yours," Mason said, offering the artifact. "I was only its keeper, until now." A pony's hand trembled as she reached for the arrow point, her fingers closing around it with surprising strength. "Not mine," she corrected weakly. "Yours to use for all of us." Mason shook his head, confused. "I don't understand. I'm not a healer." "But you are," she insisted, her voice strengthening momentarily. "You carry two medicines, Apache wisdom, white man's knowledge." Her gaze intensified. "My grandfather saw this in his vision. A man with foot in both worlds would bring healing when the new sickness came." Mason looked to Wakiza and Kichi, who had followed them into the shelter. "What is she talking about?" Kichi moved closer, his ancient eyes sharp with interest. What knowledge do you have of healing, Mason Carter? Not just wounds, but sickness? Mason considered the question. Basic field medicine mostly. Setting bones, cleaning wounds, treating common ailments. Nothing that would help with whatever this is. Tell me of the sicknesses you have seen, Kitchi pressed, especially those that come from outside, from the white man's world. Understanding began to dawn. Mason thought back to his military service, to the outbreaks that occasionally swept through forts and settlements. There were fevers sometimes, and once at Fort Buchanan, something that sounds similar to what's affecting a pony: yellowing skin, weakness, bleeding from eyes and gums. Wakiza leaned forward. What caused this sickness? How was it treated? It was the water, Mason recalled. A dead animal had fallen into the fort's well, poisoning it. We didn't discover it until people started dying. He looked down at a pony, the pieces suddenly connecting. The post surgeon treated it with activated charcoal to absorb the poison, followed by a tincture of yellow root to help the liver recover. A pony's eyes widened slightly. Water, she whispered. After soldiers came, many get sick from creek near Old Village. The implications were clear and horrifying. They poisoned your water source, Mason said, anger rising like bile in his throat. Deliberately contaminated it after the attack. Kitchi nodded grimly. We suspected something unnatural. Our people have lived in harmony with these lands for generations, knowing which plants heal and which harm. This sickness came suddenly, affecting only those who drank from that particular stream. And now you know how to treat it, Wakiza asked, hope edging his voice for the first time. Mason hesitated. Maybe. The principles should be the same, but I'm not a doctor, and I don't have access to the medicines the fort surgeon used. But we do, Kitchi said, his expression animated with renewed purpose. Charcoal we have in abundance, and yellow root, we call it golden seal, grows in the shadowed places of this very canyon. He turned to Taluta, speaking rapidly in Apache. The woman nodded and hurried from the shelter, presumably to gather the needed materials. A pony still clutched the obsidian arrow point, her knuckles white with the effort. This too, she insisted. Medicine arrow holds power when used with knowledge. Mason didn't dispute her belief, recognizing that healing often involved elements beyond the purely physical. We'll use everything available, he assured her. For the next hour, the shelter became a center of intense activity. Taluta returned with both charcoal and fresh yellow root, which Kitchi prepared according to Mason's best recollection of the fort surgeon's methods, enhanced by the old medicine man's own extensive knowledge of herbal remedies. Throughout, a pony continued to hold the obsidian arrow point, occasionally murmuring words in Apache that seemed to be prayers or incantations. Whether from faith or determination, her condition appeared to stabilize somewhat, her breathing becoming less labored. Outside, word had spread through the community. People gathered near the shelter, some bringing additional herbs or medicines they thought might help others, simply maintaining a vigil of support. Winona and Kaya remained inside, staying close to their mother, while giving the healers room to work. As night fell completely, Mason found himself in the strange position of directing an Apache healing ceremony, combining his limited medical knowledge with their traditional practices. The resulting treatment was neither fully Western nor fully indigenous, but something new, a bridge between worlds much as he himself had become. When the medicines were finally prepared and administered, Mason stepped back, allowing Kitchi and Taluta to complete the spiritual aspects of the healing. He found Winona watching him with an expression of cautious hope. "Will Mother live?" she asked directly, her young voice steady despite the fear behind the question. Mason knelt to her level, choosing honesty over false comfort. "I don't know. We've done everything possible. Now we wait and see if she's strong enough to recover." Winona nodded, accepting this answer with the same stoicism she had shown throughout their journey. Grandfather says you have healing hands, like Mother. I just shared what I knew, Mason demurred. Your grandfather and Taluta did the real healing work. No, Winona shook her head firmly. You bring two medicines together. This what grandfather's arrow point mean. Two paths joining to make new way. From the mouth of a child, the observation carried surprising weight. Mason considered it as he watched Kitchi complete the healing ritual, the old medicine man incorporating the obsidian arrow point into his ceremonial movements. Two paths joining. A bridge between worlds. Was that what Nahimana had seen when he gave Mason the sacred artifact, not just a keeper until it could be returned, but someone who would bring new understanding when it was most needed? The implications extended beyond this single healing, suggesting a future where Apache and white traditions might find points of connection rather than conflict. It seemed both improbable and essential a vision, as fragile as it was necessary. As the healing ceremony concluded, Aponi fell into an exhausted sleep, still clutching the arrow point. Kitchi announced that they had done all possible for now. The night would determine whether she lived or died. You should rest, too, Wakiza told Mason, noting his evident fatigue. You have given much of your strength to this healing. Mason nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted he truly was. The exertions of recent days, combined with his own still healing wounds, had drained him more thoroughly than he had realized. As he prepared to return to his assigned shelter, Kaya approached him, her small hand reaching for his. The child who had been silent for so long now tugged insistently, wanting him to follow her to where she had been drawing in the dirt near her mother's sleeping form. Mason knelt beside her new creation, a complex circular pattern connecting multiple figures. He recognized representations of Winona, Kaya, Aponi, Wakiza, and himself, all linked by flowing lines that formed a unified whole. Circle, Kaya said again, her voice slightly stronger than before. Family. The simple declaration from a child who had witnessed so much death and suffering struck Mason with unexpected force. Family. Not by blood, but by choice and circumstance, by the mysterious workings of fate that had brought him to that wolf-threatened campsite, and then to this hidden canyon. Yes, he agreed softly. Family. As he finally left the healing lodge, guided back to his shelter by Ahote Mason, carried that word with him like a talisman against the darkness. Family. A concept he had abandoned years ago when he joined the cavalry, believing his only brotherhood would be found among soldiers. Now, in the most unlikely of circumstances, he had found something both simpler and more profound, a connection that transcended the divisions of race and history, of soldier and Apache, of past and present. Whether Aponi lived or died, whether the council accepted him or sent him away, that connection had been forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual aid. And Mason knew with a certainty that defied rational explanation that his journey had led him exactly where he was meant to be. The arrow had found its owner, not just Aponi, but all of them together. The circle Kaya had drawn, connecting separate lives into a unified whole. As sleep claimed him once more, Mason's last conscious thought was of that circle unbroken, complete, and healing. Dawn broke over the hidden canyon with gentle persistence, golden light spilling down the eastern wall to touch the valley floor with warmth. Mason woke to the sound of activity outside his shelter, voices speaking in Apache, the movement of people going about their morning tasks, a sense of purpose and anticipation that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. His first thought was of Aponi. Had she survived the night? Had their improvised treatment made any difference against the poison that ravaged her body? Before he could rise to seek answers, the shelter flap moved aside, revealing Winona. The girl's face showed signs of exhaustion, dark circles beneath her eyes, suggesting a night spent without sleep, but her expression held something Mason hadn't seen before: hope. "Mother awake," she said simply, "asking for you." Mason sat up quickly, wincing as his wounds protested the sudden movement. The herbal poultice Taluta had applied had dried overnight, pulling at his skin as he flexed his shoulder. But the pain was less intense than before, the angry red lines of infection visibly receding. "How is she?" he asked, reaching for his shirt. "Stronger, fever gone." Winona's composure cracked slightly, allowing a glimpse of the child beneath the stoic exterior. "She drank water, ate little food. Says medicine arrow working." Relief washed through Mason, whether from the charcoal and yellow root treatment, or the spiritual power of the obsidian arrow point, or some combination of both. Apache had survived the critical night. It wasn't a complete recovery, but it was a significant improvement from her condition the previous evening. "That's good news," he said, pulling on his boots. "Very good news." Winona nodded, her dark eyes watching him with that same evaluating intensity that seemed characteristic of her family. "Council wants to see you after you visit Mother. Grandfather says, important decision to make." The reminder of his uncertain status within the Apache community tempered Mason's relief. Despite his role in Apache's treatment and his protection of the children, he remained an outsider, former cavalry scout representative of the forces that had brought so much suffering to these people. "I understand," he said, rising to follow Winona from the shelter. Outside, the hidden canyon was fully awake, bathed in the soft light of early morning. People moved about their tasks, some pausing to watch as Mason passed, their expressions ranging from curiosity to cautious respect. Word of his part in Apache's treatment had clearly spread throughout the small community, creating a subtle shift in how he was perceived. Ahote appeared from nearby, falling into step beside them. The warrior's face revealed nothing of his thoughts, but his presence seemed less like a guard and more like an escort, a significant distinction that wasn't lost on Mason. They reached the healing lodge to find it surrounded by people bringing offerings, bundles of herbs, woven baskets containing food, small items of personal significance. Kitchi stood at the entrance, accepting these gifts with dignified gratitude, speaking brief words to each person that Mason couldn't understand, but recognized as blessings or acknowledgments. The elder nodded to Mason as they approached, his ancient eyes bright with approval. "She lives," he said simply. The two medicines together proved stronger than the poison. Mason accepted this assessment without comment, understanding that in Kitchi's worldview, the combined power of Apache healing traditions and Western medical knowledge had created something new and more effective than either alone. Inside the lodge, the atmosphere had transformed from the previous night's desperate intensity to something approaching peace. The fire burned low, its smoke carrying the sweet scent of cedar and sage. Taluta moved quietly about, organizing healing supplies and tending to the small comforts that made the difference between mere survival and actual recovery. Apache lay on her sleeping platform, propped up slightly with folded blankets. Though still pale and clearly weakened, the sickly yellow tinge had faded from her skin, and her eyes, so like her daughter's, were clear and alert. The obsidian arrow point rested on a small woven mat beside her, its polished surface catching and reflecting the firelight. Kaya sat close to her mother, holding her hand, with the fierce, protective instinct of a child who had nearly lost too much. When she saw Mason enter, her face brightened with recognition, and she tugged at Apache's hand, directing her attention to the newcomer. "Mason Carter!" Apache said, her voice stronger than the previous night, but still bearing the rasp of recent illness. "My daughter's protector, my father's chosen one." Mason moved closer, kneeling beside the sleeping platform at a respectful distance. I'm glad to see you improving, he said simply. Apone studied him with penetrating intensity, as if reading something written in the lines of his face. The poison nearly won, she said after a moment. But you brought knowledge my people did not have, just as my father foresaw. It was a combination of both traditions, Mason corrected gently. Kichi and Taluta provided the healing plants and spiritual guidance. I only contributed a small piece of information. A piece that made the difference between life and death. Apone's gaze didn't waver. Not just for me, but potentially for our entire people. The sickness that struck our old village has appeared in other Apache camps as well. Now we know how to fight it. The implications weren't lost on Mason. If the cavalry was systematically poisoning water sources near Apache settlements, the knowledge of how to treat the resulting illness could save hundreds of lives. You should rest, he said, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her eyes. Regain your strength. Apone smiled faintly. Always the practical soldier. She glanced at the obsidian arrow point beside her. Do you understand now why my father gave you this? Why he saw you as a bridge between worlds? Mason hesitated the question, touching on matters beyond his usual considerations. I'm beginning to, he admitted, though I'm not sure I'm worthy of the role he envisioned. Worthiness is determined by actions, not by belief in oneself. Apone's words carried the weight of generations of wisdom. You acted to save my children when they were strangers to you. You risked your life to protect our hidden home. You shared knowledge that saved lives, asking nothing in return. She reached for the arrow point, lifting it with newfound strength. These are the actions of one worthy to carry this medicine. Before Mason could respond, Winona spoke from where she stood near the entrance. Mother Council waiting. Grandfather says time for decision. Apone nodded, her expression turning serious. Help me rise, she instructed Taluta. I must attend this council. The healer looked alarmed. Too soon, she protested in accented English. Need more rest. Some matters cannot wait for perfect health, Apone insisted. This decision affects all our people and I must be present. Mason stood concerned by her determination to push her recovering body. The council can come to you, he suggested, or wait until you're stronger. Apone's expression softened slightly. Your concern is noted, Mason Carter, but there are protocols that must be observed, traditions that give our decisions their power. With Taluta's reluctant assistance, she rose to a sitting position, then carefully to her feet. Besides, I have been lying down too long. My spirit needs to stand even if my body protests. There was no arguing with her resolve. Mason stepped back, watching as Apone steadied herself, drawing dignity around her like a cloak, despite her physical weakness. Winona and Kaya moved to her sides, offering their small shoulders as additional support. Come, Apone said, the arrow point clutched firmly in her hand. The council awaits. They emerged from the healing lodge into the full morning light, Apone's appearance drawing murmurs of approval and relief from the gathered community. Word spread quickly, and by the time they reached the central council area, most of the settlement's inhabitants had assembled to witness the proceedings. Wakiza stood as they approached, his stoic features softening momentarily at the sight of his daughter walking under her own power. He gestured to a place of honor within the council circle where furs had been arranged to provide comfortable seating for the recovering healer. Mason remained standing at the edge of the circle, uncertain of his place in these formal proceedings. Ahote positioned himself nearby, his presence still ambiguous between guard and ally. When all had settled, Wakiza addressed the gathering in Apache, his deep voice carrying across the hushed assembly. Winona moved close to Mason, providing quiet translation. Grandfather says this day brings many signs from the spirits. The great healer lives when many thought she would die. The children returned safely when they might have been lost. The enemy's big gun burns before it can destroy our hidden home." She paused, listening. Now council must decide what these signs mean for our people and for you. Hitchi spoke next, his ancient voice surprisingly strong as he recounted what Mason understood to be the history of the obsidian arrow point, its origins in the distant past, its passage through generations of healers in their family line, and finally its temporary entrusting to Mason by Nahimana. He says his brother's son, my grandfather, had a powerful vision. Winona translated, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Saw time when old ways alone would not save our people. Saw need for new knowledge, new understandings, if Apache were to survive changing world. Aponi then addressed the council, her voice steady, despite her evident weakness. Though Mason couldn't understand her words directly, the passion behind them was unmistakable. A healer's conviction, a mother's gratitude, a leader's vision for her people's future. Throughout her speech, she held the obsidian arrow point aloft, occasionally pointing it toward Mason with deliberate significance. When she finally concluded, a murmur of discussion rippled through the assembly, elders and warriors debating among themselves while Wakaza listened impassively. "What's happening?" Mason asked Winona quietly. "What are they discussing?" The girl's expression was solemn. "Whether to accept you into tribe, make you family in truth, not just words." She glanced up at him, a hint of anxiety in her eyes. Very serious decision, not done lightly. Mason nodded, understanding the gravity of what was being considered. For an Apache band to formally adopt a white man, especially one who had formerly served with the cavalry, was unprecedented in his experience. It would bind him to their community with obligations and expectations he was only beginning to comprehend. Wakiza rose after the discussions had continued for some time, raising his hand for silence. When he spoke, his words were measured and formal, carrying the weight of final judgment. "My father says decision is made," Winona translated. "Council has heard all voices, considered all signs." She paused, listening intently. He says you are to be accepted as Dine, as one of the people. Given Apache name, recognized as father to his granddaughters, brother to our warriors." The pronouncement hung in the air, its significance rippling through the assembled community. Some nodded in approval, others looked uncertain or concerned, but none voiced open opposition to their leader's decision. Wakiza gestured for Mason to step forward into the center of the council circle. As he did so, Aponi rose from her seat, the effort clearly taxing her recovering strength, but her expression resolute. "The ceremony requires witness from family," Winona explained softly. "Mother stands for daughters." Mason stood before Wakiza, acutely aware of the historical weight of this moment. Centuries of conflict between their peoples distilled to this single point of potential reconciliation, however small and symbolic it might be in the larger context of the ongoing war. Wakaza spoke directly to him now in English, out of respect for the solemnity of the occasion. "Mason Carter, you have walked a path few white men would choose. You turned away from your people's war against the people. You risked your life to save Apache children. You shared knowledge that saved my daughter's life." The war chief's gaze was penetrating, searching for any hesitation or insincerity. "Are you prepared to become part of our circle, to accept the responsibilities of family among the people?" The question demanded honest consideration. Mason knew that accepting this offer meant more than simple gratitude or temporary alliance. It represented a fundamental shift in his identity, a commitment to people whom he had once tracked and fought against as enemies. Yet, as he looked at Aponi, standing tall despite her weakness, at Winona, translating with grave dignity beyond her years, at Kaya, watching him with those expressive eyes that had begun to heal from their haunted emptiness. He recognized a truth that had been forming within him since that first night among the wolves. "I am prepared," he said, his voice steady and certain. "I accept the responsibilities of family." Wakiza nodded once, accepting his answer. "Then hear your Apache name chosen by the council in recognition of your deeds and spirit." He paused, the moment expanding with significance. "You will be known among the people as Tarak, he who protects in darkness." The name resonated with Mason, capturing the essence of his actions, since Eagle Canyon operating in shadows, using darkness to shield those who needed protection, finding his way through moral twilight toward a clearer dawn. Kitchi stepped forward, carrying a small earthen bowl containing a mixture of red ochre and bear fat. With his gnarled finger, he traced symbols on Mason's forehead and cheeks, markings that Winona later explained signified protection, healing, and belonging. A pony approached next, the obsidian arrow point still clutched in her hand. "This belongs with you now," she said, pressing it into his palm. "Not as temporary keeper, but as rightful guardian. The bridge between worlds my father foresaw." Mason started to protest, but she closed his fingers around the artifact with surprising strength. "A healer recognizes when medicine has found its proper home," she said with quiet finality. "This is yours now to use in service to both your peoples." The ceremony concluded with Wakiza placing around Mason's neck a necklace of silver and turquoise, a symbol of his new status within the tribe, and a marker that would identify him to other Apache bands as a friend rather than enemy. As the formal proceedings ended, the community began to disperse, many approaching to touch Mason briefly on the arm or shoulder, simple gestures of acceptance that required no translation. Children who had previously watched him with wary suspicion now darted close, curious about this strange addition to their community. Winona and Kaya remained close, their expressions a mixture of solemnity and barely suppressed excitement. "Now you really are family," Winona said, a rare smile brightening her young face. Kaya, still sparing with her newly recovered voice, simply took his hand and squeezed it. Her dark eyes conveying what words could not, a child's uncomplicated joy at having found security in a world that had taken too much from her too quickly. The moment of celebration was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the gathering. A young Apache scout burst into the council area, breathing hard from what had clearly been a long, fast run. He spoke rapidly to Wakiza, his words urgent and alarming based on the war chief's immediate reaction. "What's happening?" Mason asked Winona. The girl's expression had turned grave again. "Scout says soldiers coming. Not same ones you delayed, different soldiers from west side. Many of them with Apache scouts leading them." Her voice dropped. "He says they very close to hidden entrance." Mason immediately grasped the implications. The cavalry detachment he had delayed was only one prong of a larger operation. While he had been focused on Hargrove's unit approaching from the east, another force had been circling from the west, guided by Apache scouts who had either been captured or turned traitor. Wakiza was already issuing rapid orders, warriors rushing to gather weapons, women organizing the evacuation of children and elders to predetermined refuge points deeper in the canyon system. The peaceful morning had transformed in moments to urgent preparation for battle or flight. A pony swayed slightly, the excitement and exertion of the ceremony having taxed her recovering strength. Taluta moved to support her, but a pony's gaze remained fixed on Mason. "My daughters," she said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "They must be taken to the inner sanctuary. If soldiers breach our defenses," Mason understood immediately. If the cavalry broke through captured children, especially the granddaughters of Wakiza himself, would become valuable hostages, or worse. "I'll protect them," he promised. "Get them to safety." A pony nodded relief visible beneath her concern. "Winona knows the way to the hidden caves. Go now while there is still time." Mason turned to the girls. "Gather only what you need, quickly." Winona was already moving, pulling Kaya with her toward their family shelter. Mason followed his mind, racing through the tactical situation. If cavalry had discovered the hidden entrance, they would have to move fast to evacuate the most vulnerable members of the community before the soldiers breached the canyon's defenses. Inside the shelter, Winona efficiently collected a few essential items: a water skin, a small bag of dried food, an extra blanket for each of them. Kaya clutched a tiny woven doll to her chest, her eyes wide with the return of fear, but no longer empty with shock, as they had been after the wolf attack. "Ready," Winona announced, shouldering the small pack. Mason led them back outside where organized chaos had engulfed the settlement. Warriors were taking up defensive positions along the canyon walls and near the hidden entrance, while women and older children helped the elderly toward evacuation routes deeper into the canyon system. Wakiza intercepted them, his expression grim but controlled. "Take South Path," he instructed Mason, pointing toward a narrow trail that climbed the canyon wall. "Leads to caves above waterfall. Defensible position, easy to hide." Mason nodded his understanding. "How many soldiers?" "Scout counts 30, maybe more. With cannon." Wakiza's jaw tightened. "They find secret entrance somehow. Have Apache traitors showing way." The mention of a cannon sent a chill through Mason. His sabotage of Hargrove's howitzer had only delayed one part of the military operation. This second force came equally well equipped for assault on the hidden canyon. "We'll reach the caves safely," Mason assured the war chief. "Focus on your defense." Wakiza clasped his shoulder briefly, the gesture of one warrior to another, transcending their different origins. "Protect my granddaughters, Terak. They are future of our people." "With my life," Mason promised. With a final nod, Wakiza strode away, calling warriors to his side as he organized the canyon's defense. Mason turned to the girls, keeping his voice calm despite the urgency of their situation. "Stay close to me. Move quickly, but carefully. No noise." They set off toward the south path, weaving through the increasingly frantic activity of the settlement. The trail proved to be little more than a goat track, zigzagging up the steep canyon wall, requiring careful navigation even under the best circumstances. They had climbed perhaps halfway to the caves when the first sounds of conflict reached them, shouts and rifle fire echoing from the canyon entrance, followed by the deeper boom of a cannon. The defensive battle had begun. Mason urged the girls to move faster, helping Kaya over particularly difficult sections of the trail. Above them, the promised caves were visible as dark openings in the canyon wall just below where the waterfall cascaded from the rim. They were within 50 yards of safety when disaster struck. A cannon shot aimed high to clear the canyon's defensive positions struck the wall above them. Rock fragments rained down, some large enough to pose serious danger. Mason pulled the girls against the cliff face, shielding them with his body, as debris clattered around them. When the immediate danger passed, they continued upward with renewed urgency. But the cannon fire had destabilized the narrow trail. As they neared the final approach to the caves, a section of path crumbled beneath Winona's feet. The girl cried out, beginning to slide toward the precipitous drop to the canyon floor far below. Mason lunged, catching her wrist before she could fall, but the movement threw him off balance on the unstable ground. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed all three might go over the edge together. Then Kaya acted with surprising strength and presence of mind, anchoring herself against a solid rock outcropping and grabbing her sister's other arm. Together, they managed to pull Winona back to safety, all three collapsing on the narrow trail, breathing hard from exertion and fear. "Thank you," Winona gasped, her usual composure shaken by the near-fatal fall. Mason gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "That's what family does." They reached the caves without further incident, finding them already occupied by several Apache elders and mothers with young children. A teenage boy who appeared to be in charge of the evacuation directed them to a smaller cave higher up, where they would have a better view of the battle below while remaining hidden from direct observation. From this elevated position, Mason could see the full extent of the conflict unfolding in the canyon. The cavalry had indeed breached the hidden entrance, a column of blue-uniformed soldiers pouring into the western end of the valley. Apache warriors harried them from elevated positions, using the canyon walls for cover as they fired on the exposed troops. But the military force had come prepared for this fight. The cannons set up just inside the entrance fired repeatedly at defensive positions, while officers directed disciplined volleys at any Apache who showed themselves long enough to loose an arrow or fire a rifle. It was an uneven match. Despite the advantage of familiar terrain and elevated positions, the Apache defenders were outnumbered and outgunned. Mason watched with growing concern as they were gradually pushed back toward the center of the settlement. "Will they win?" Winona asked, her voice small, as she watched her people fighting for their home. Mason couldn't bring himself to lie to her. "It's a difficult battle," he said carefully. "Your grandfather is a great war leader. He'll find a way to protect as many as possible." Winona nodded, understanding the unspoken assessment. This wasn't a fight for victory. It was a delaying action to allow the most vulnerable members of the community to escape deeper into the canyon system. As they watched, the battle below intensified. The soldiers had reached the first shelters, some breaking formation to search for valuables or captives, while others maintained disciplined fire on the retreating Apache warriors. Mason's attention was drawn to a figure directing the military advance. An officer on horseback gesturing with a saber as he ordered his men forward. Even at this distance, something about the man's bearing seemed familiar. When the officer turned his mount to face directly toward their position, Mason felt a shock of recognition. Major Reynolds Hargroves, superior officer, and the commander of Fort Buchanan. The man who had authorized the Eagle Canyon massacre and who had subsequently ordered Mason's capture or killing. The major's presence explained much about the coordinated nature of the attack. Two columns converging from different directions detailed intelligence about the hidden canyon's location and defenses. This wasn't a routine patrol or punitive expedition. It was a carefully planned operation aimed at destroying Wakaza's stronghold once and for all. "They're driving your people toward the eastern end of the canyon." Mason observed military training, allowing him to read the battlefield tactics, trying to trap them between the two forces. "Other soldiers?" Winona asked, understanding immediately. "The ones you delay. Yes, they're counting on that second unit to block the eastern escape routes." Mason allowed himself a grim smile. "But they don't know those soldiers won't arrive in time thanks to our night's work." This tactical error might provide the only advantage Wakiza needed to save the majority of his people. If the Apache could break through the eastern end of the canyon before the 2nd Cavalry Unit arrived to block it, they could scatter into the wilderness where pursuit would be difficult and costly. Mason continued studying the battlefield, looking for any way he might help from his current position. Direct intervention was impossible. Even if he had been willing to leave the girls, he was too far from the fighting to make any meaningful difference. But as he watched, he noticed something concerning. Major Reynolds had dispatched a small detachment of soldiers toward the southern wall of the canyon, the very section where the evacuation caves were located. Whether acting on intelligence about the refuges or simply securing the perimeter, they were heading directly toward the hidden paths that led to Mason and the girls. "We need to move," he told Winona urgently. "Soldiers coming this way. Is there another path from these caves?" Away deeper into the mountains? Winona nodded, her expression tightening with renewed fear. Yes, through back of big cave, leads to high places, then down to forest, beyond canyon. Good. Gather your things. Tell the others quietly, no panic, but they need to move now. While Winona spread the warning among the other refugees, Mason took stock of their resources. Between his own weapons and those carried by a couple of elderly men among the evacuees, they had 3 rifles and limited ammunition. Not enough for a prolonged defense, but perhaps sufficient to delay pursuit, while the most vulnerable escaped. They began moving people toward the rear of the main cave, where a narrow passage led deeper into the mountain. The elderly went first, helped by older children, followed by mothers with infants. Mason organized the few capable fighters into a rear guard, positioning them where they could cover the approach trail if the soldiers discovered their location. Winona and Kaya helped coordinate the evacuation, their natural authority as Wakaza's granddaughters, ensuring cooperation even from adults many times their age. Mason watched with pride as they guided frightened children with calm reassurance, their own fear contained beneath a veneer of confident purpose. The evacuation was nearly complete when the first soldiers appeared on the trail below. 6 men moving cautiously up the path where Mason and the girls had ascended earlier. Their progress was slow due to the difficult terrain, but they were methodically checking each potential hiding place as they climbed. "They'll reach us in minutes," Mason told the small group of fighters that remained. "We need to slow them down, give the others time to reach safety." An elderly Apache man nodded grimly, checking his ancient but well-maintained rifle. "We hold them," he agreed in halting English. "You take children, follow others." Mason hesitated, torn between his promise to protect the girls and his instinct to stand with these brave few against superior numbers. Before he could decide, Winona appeared at his side, her expression resolute. "We almost ready," she reported. "Everyone moving through passage except us." Mason nodded. "Good. You and Kaya need to go now, catch up with the others. I'll stay with the rear guard, make sure the soldiers don't follow too quickly." Winona's eyes widened with alarm. "No, you promised, Mother. Said you protect us." "I am protecting you," Mason insisted gently, "by making sure these soldiers don't reach the passage." But the girl's expression hardened with familiar stubbornness. "We stay together. Family stays together." Before Mason could argue further, a shot rang out from below, one of the soldiers firing at a movement he had spotted near the cave entrance. The bullet ricocheted off the rock face, sending stone chips flying. "No more time," the elderly Apache warrior said, raising his rifle. "Go now! We delay them." Mason made his decision. "Come," he told Winona urgently. "We need to catch up with the others." They retreated deeper into the cave as the first exchange of gunfire erupted behind them. Kaya waited just inside the narrow passage that led to safety, her small face tight with fear, but her eyes clear and focused. The passage proved to be long and winding, requiring them to proceed single file through sections so tight that Mason had to turn sideways to pass. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew muffled, then faded entirely as the tortuous path carried them deeper into the mountain's heart. They caught up with the main group of evacuees at a junction where the passage widened into a modest chamber. An elderly woman who seemed to be guiding the evacuation explained through Winona that they faced a choice. One path led upward to high meadows above the canyon rim. The other descended through a series of caverns to eventually emerge in a forested valley beyond the mountains. "Most going down path," Winona translated. "Safer for old ones and small children, but slower, and soldiers might guess where it comes out." Mason considered the tactical situation. The soldiers would indeed anticipate the escaping Apache to take the easier downward route. If they secured the canyon quickly enough, they could potentially send riders around the mountain to intercept the refugees where the lower passage emerged. "What about the upper path?" he asked. "Where does it lead?" Winona conferred with the elderly guide, then reported back. "Goes to high meadows, very exposed. Then can go many directions: north to flatlands, east to river valleys, south to higher mountains. Harder travel, but more choices for escape." The strategic advantage was clear. The upper route offered flexibility and unpredictability, making pursuit more difficult. But it would also be more challenging for the elderly and very young, requiring strength and endurance that many lacked after the sudden evacuation. "We should split up," Mason decided. "Those who can manage difficult terrain take the upper path, scatter in different directions once they reach the meadows. The rest continue on the lower route, but prepare for possible confrontation at the exit." When Winona translated this suggestion, the elderly guide nodded approval, immediately beginning to organize the division. Families with young children, the elderly, and the injured would take the lower path. The more able-bodied, including a few warriors who had joined the evacuation after covering the community's retreat, would take the upper route to draw pursuit away from the more vulnerable group. "Which way we go?" Winona asked clearly, assuming they would stay together regardless of the choice. Mason hesitated. The upper path would be challenging, but offered better chances of ultimate escape. The lower path would be easier for the girls, but might lead directly into a military ambush. Before he could answer, new sounds echoed from the passage behind them, boots on stone, men's voices calling to each other. The rear guard had fallen or been pushed back, and soldiers were now in the tunnel system. "Upper path," Mason decided instantly. "Run now." They joined the smaller group climbing toward the surface, the narrow trail switchbacking steeply upward through increasingly tight passages. Winona led the way, her knowledge of the route proving invaluable as they navigated in near darkness. Kaya followed her small form, moving with surprising agility through the difficult terrain. Mason brought up the rear of their small family unit, constantly checking behind for signs of pursuit. The climb seemed endless, their progress slowed by the difficult terrain and the need to help others in their group. Mason's wounds throbbed with renewed pain, the exertion reopening barely healed injuries. But he pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that safety for himself and the girls lay in reaching the open country above. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was likely less than one, they emerged onto a high alpine meadow bathed in midday sunlight. The contrast after the darkness of the caves was momentarily blinding, forcing them to pause and adjust to the sudden brightness. When Mason's vision cleared, he found himself looking out over a spectacular landscape, rolling meadows giving way to forested slopes, distant mountain ranges blue on the horizon, the vast openness of sky above. After the confined spaces of the canyon and caves, the expansiveness felt almost overwhelming. The Apache and their group wasted no time in strategic discussion. With minimal conversation, they divided into smaller family units, each choosing a different direction of travel. Within minutes, they had dispersed across the meadow, making their way toward various escape routes with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to rapid movement through wilderness. "Where should we go?" Winona asked, looking to Mason for direction. He scanned the landscape, assessing options based on his knowledge of military tactics and natural barriers. "North first," he decided. "Then east toward the river country. The cavalry will expect Wakaza's people to head south toward traditional Apache territory." Winona nodded, accepting his reasoning. "Many days' journey to reach river valleys." "Yes, but we have some advantages. Small group able to move quickly, knowledge of the land." Mason checked his weapons and their limited supplies. "We'll manage." As they prepared to set off across the meadow, a final group emerged from the cave entrance, the last of the warriors who had covered the retreat. Among them, Mason was surprised and relieved to recognize Ahote, the young warrior bearing a bloody scratch across his cheek, but otherwise appearing unharmed. Ahote approached them quickly, his expression grave. "Soldiers in tunnels," he reported. "Coming this way. Not many, but coming fast." "How far behind?" Mason asked, already calculating how much distance they needed to maintain. "Minutes only." Ahote glanced toward the cave entrance. 5, maybe 6 men. Officer leading them. The news was concerning, but not unexpected. A small mobile force could potentially move through the tunnel system more quickly than the larger group of refugees. Their head start might be less substantial than Mason had hoped. "We need to move now," he told Winona and Kaya. "Fast as possible to reach the tree line before they emerge." Ahote gestured toward the northern edge of the meadow. "I know hidden places that way. Come with me." The offer of guidance was welcome. Mason nodded his acceptance, and their small group set off at a pace that balanced speed with the endurance needed for a long journey. Kaya, despite her size, kept up admirably, her natural resilience asserting itself in this crisis. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the tree line when shouts behind them announced the soldiers' emergence from the cave. Mason glanced back to see several blue-uniformed men spilling onto the meadow, momentarily disoriented by the brightness, but quickly organizing into pursuit formation. At their head, mounted on a horse, he must have led through the larger sections of the tunnel road Major Reynolds himself. The officer raised field glasses to scan the meadow, his attention moving methodically across the dispersing Apache groups. "Down," Mason ordered, pulling the children into a shallow depression where the meadow grass grew taller. Ahote dropped beside them, his body flat against the earth. Through the swaying grass stems, Mason watched as Reynolds completed his survey of the fleeing refugees. For a moment, it seemed the major might order his men to pursue one of the other groups. Then, with deliberate precision, he pointed his saber directly toward Mason's position. "He's spotted us," Mason said grimly, "or guessed our direction." Ahote's expression darkened. "How he know?" Mason had a sinking suspicion. "He's targeting me specifically. Probably has descriptions from Hargrove's men about the white man traveling with Apache children." He checked the distance to the tree line still too far to reach, before mounted pursuit would overtake them. "We need to split up, create confusion." "No," Winona said firmly, echoing her earlier position. "Stay together." Mason shook his head. "Not permanently, just long enough to confuse them, divide their forces." He turned to Ahote. "You take the girls' angle northeast toward those rocks. I'll head northwest, more visible, draw their attention." Ahote understood the tactical reasoning, but looked doubtful. "Girls trust you more than me." Winona listened carefully. Mason said, meeting her worried gaze directly. "This is still protecting you, just in a different way. Major Reynolds wants me more than anyone else. If I lead him away, you'll have a better chance to escape with Ahote." The girl's expression showed her struggle between fear of separation and understanding of the strategy. "You find us after promise." "I promise." Mason squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "Remember what Kaya drew? The circle? We're connected now, no matter what happens." Winona translated this quickly for her sister. Kaya's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded bravely, reaching into her small bag to withdraw something, the knotted cord she had given Mason before his confrontation with Hargrove's unit. "For luck," Winona translated as Kaya pressed it into his hand. "Come back." Mason tucked the cord carefully into his shirt pocket next to his heart. "I will," he promised. "Now go with Ahote. Don't look back no matter what you hear." With a final nod to the warrior, Mason rose to a crouch ready to break in the opposite direction. Wait until they focus on me, then move fast and quiet toward the rocks." Without waiting for further discussion, Mason launched himself from the depression, running at full speed across the open meadow. Behind him, he heard shouts of discovery followed by the thunder of hoofbeats as Reynolds ordered the pursuit. Mason angled toward a section of forest that offered dense cover, pushing his body to its limits despite the protest of his wounds. A quick glance over his shoulder confirmed his strategy was working. Reynolds and most of his men were focused entirely on capturing the deserter, leaving only one soldier to continue monitoring the rest of the meadow. He reached the tree line barely ahead of his pursuers, plunging into the forest where the soldiers' horses would become more hindrance than help. Behind him, he heard Reynolds shouting orders, the sounds of men dismounting to continue the chase on foot. Mason moved deeper into the woods, using every trick he had learned during his years as a scout to confuse his trail, crossing streams, doubling back, using fallen logs to leave gaps in his tracks. His only goal now was to lead the soldiers as far from the girl's escape route as possible, to buy time for Ahot to get them safely to the river valleys, where pursuit would be nearly impossible. The chase continued through the afternoon, Mason staying just far enough ahead to remain free while close enough to ensure the soldiers didn't abandon the pursuit in favor of easier targets. His strength began to wane as the day progressed, his wounds reopening his reserves depleted by days of exertion and limited food. As dusk approached, he found himself in increasingly difficult terrain, a rocky slope leading toward a series of cliffs that promised both danger and potential sanctuary. If he could reach the higher ground before full darkness, he might find a defensible position to rest and reassess his situation. The sound of a rifle shot cracked through the forest, the bullet splintering bark from a tree inches from his head. Mason ducked instinctively, rolling behind a boulder for cover. More shots followed, suggesting the soldiers had split into a skirmish line to sweep the area. Mason checked his weapons, 2 rounds left in his rifle, 4 in Hargrove's revolver. Not enough for a prolonged engagement, but perhaps sufficient to hold them off until darkness provided better cover for escape. He waited, controlling his breathing, listening for movement that would betray his pursuers' positions. The forest had gone quiet, birds and small animals silenced by the gunfire and human intrusion. Then a voice called out, confident, authoritative, chillingly familiar. "Carter, I know you're within earshot. This pointless chase ends now." Major Reynolds, the officer who had authorized the Eagle Canyon massacre, who had ordered Mason's death when he refused to participate, who now led the assault on Wakiza's hidden sanctuary. Mason remained silent, calculating distances and angles for potential escape routes. "You've led us on quite a pursuit," Reynolds continued. "Impressive, especially for a wounded man. But it's over. My men have you surrounded, and darkness won't save you in terrain you don't know." Still, Mason held his position and his silence. Reynolds was attempting to flush him out through intimidation, a standard tactic, but one that only worked if the target lost composure. "Perhaps you're wondering about your little Apache companions." The Major's voice took on a crueler edge. "Don't waste your concern. The girl and her sister will be well treated, as befits the granddaughters of Wakiza. Excellent hostages to ensure their grandfather's future cooperation." The implication sent a chill through Mason. Had Reynolds captured Winona and Kaya despite his diversion, or was this merely a psychological ploy to provoke a reaction? "I'm offering you a choice, Carter," Reynolds continued after a pause. "Surrender now, face court-martial as regulations require, and I'll personally ensure the children remain unharmed. Continue this futile resistance, and I make no such guarantees." Mason weighed his limited options. If Reynolds was bluffing about capturing the girl's surrender would accomplish nothing except his own execution. If the Major spoke truth, the calculus became more complicated, his life against their safety. The obsidian arrow point pressed against his side, where it rested in its pouch, a physical reminder of his newly forged connections and responsibilities. Family stays together, Winona had insisted. The circle Kaya had drawn, connecting them all regardless of distance or circumstance. Making his decision, Mason raised his voice to carry through the forest. "Prove you have them. Let me hear their voices." A pause followed, then Reynolds called back. "A reasonable request. Unfortunately, they are not with my immediate party. They are being escorted back to the canyon as we speak. But I give you my word as an officer that they were captured attempting to reach the northern rocks." The response confirmed Mason's suspicion Reynolds was bluffing, using the children as leverage he didn't possess. Ahote would have been too skilled to allow easy capture, and the Major's description of their direction was vague enough to apply to several groups that had fled the meadow. "Your word means nothing," Mason responded, shifting position slightly as he spoke to prevent the voice from revealing his exact location. "I was at Eagle Canyon. I saw what an officer's word is worth when dealing with Apache." Reynolds's tone hardened. Eagle Canyon was a military necessity. The Apache delegation was using peace talks as cover to scout our defenses. Hargrove acted on my direct authorization. "They were unarmed," Mason countered, continuing to move between cover positions. "They came in good faith." "There is no good faith with savages." Reynolds snapped, his composure cracking slightly. "Something you seem to have forgotten, Scout Carter. Your sympathy for the enemy constitutes treason against your country and your race." Mason had reached the edge of a small clearing beyond which the ground rose sharply toward the cliffs he had been aiming for. Crossing that open space would make him vulnerable, but remaining in his current position would only delay the inevitable as the soldiers tightened their search perimeter. "Last chance, Carter," Reynolds called, his voice closer now. "Surrender honorably or die a traitor's death." Instead of responding, Mason took a deep breath and sprinted across the clearing. Rifle fire erupted behind him, bullets kicking up dirt at his heels. He reached the rocky slope and began to climb, using natural features for cover as he ascended. More shots followed, but the increasing distance and difficult angles made accuracy impossible. Mason continued upward, finding handholds and footholds in the failing light, driven by determination and the knowledge that each foot of elevation increased his chances of ultimate escape. Near the top of the cliff face, he found what he had hoped for, a narrow ledge leading to a small cave opening, defensible and sheltered. He pulled himself onto the ledge just as darkness claimed the forest below, obscuring him from the searcher's view. Inside the shallow cave, Mason collapsed against the rock wall, exhaustion finally claiming its due. His shoulder wound had reopened during the climb, blood soaking through Taluta's bandages. The wolf bite on his arm throbbed with dull persistence. Every muscle ached from days of exertion and minimal rest. But he had accomplished his primary goal, leading Reynolds and his men away from the girls' escape route, buying time for Ahote to guide them to safety. Whether he himself survived the night and the coming day remained uncertain, but Winona and Kaya had a fighting chance to reach the river valleys where pursuit would be virtually impossible. As full darkness enveloped the landscape, Mason allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. His journey had carried him from Eagle Canyon to this precarious perch through a series of choices and circumstances that seemed too perfect in their alignment to be mere coincidence. The obsidian arrow point that had guided him to the girls when they needed him most. The knowledge that had saved a pony's life when traditional remedies had failed. The skills that had delayed Hargrove's artillery long enough for the Apache to evacuate their hidden sanctuary. Nahimana's words echoed in his memory. "When it finds its rightful owner, blood debt will be paid, and your soul healed." The old medicine man's prophecy seemed to be fulfilling itself in ways Mason couldn't have imagined when he pulled a drowning elder from a flash flood 5 years earlier. Not through any single dramatic act of redemption, but through a series of choices to stand between innocence and harm, to use his knowledge in service of healing rather than destruction, to embrace connection rather than division. From the cave entrance, Mason could see stars beginning to emerge in the night sky. The same stars he had shown Kaya during their journey. The same patterns that had guided human movements since time immemorial. Somewhere beneath those stars, Winona and Kaya were moving steadily eastward, carrying with them the hope and future of their people. And carrying a piece of him as well, the part that had found redemption in their trust, healing in their acceptance, family in their circle of connection. Mason touched the knotted cord in his pocket, drawing strength from the simple gift. He would rest tonight, tend his wounds as best he could, and with dawn would begin his own journey eastward. Not running from his past anymore, but moving toward a future that held both purpose and belonging. The arrow had found its owner. The blood debt was being paid, and in the process his soul had begun to heal. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Reynolds and his men would continue the search. The journey to the river valleys would be long and arduous. The future of Wakaza's people remained uncertain in a changing world, increasingly hostile to their way of life. But tonight, in this moment of hard-earned peace, Mason Carter, now Tarak, he who protects in darkness, allowed himself to believe in the circle Kaya had drawn. A circle that connected lives across the divisions of race and history, of soldier and Apache, of past and present. A circle that would somehow bring them together again beneath these same eternal stars. End of Part 3.